This isn't going to work. Zorian stopped staring at the pile of blueprints and notebooks in front of him and looked at the speaker. It was Svim. He and Alanik had snuck up to him while his attention was absorbed into his task and were currently staring at him expectantly. Zorian tapped his pen on the table a couple of times before throwing it aside and leaning back in his chair. Perhaps it would be a good idea to take a break. His work had stalled for a while now. "I'm not sure I understand," he told his old mentor. "We can't keep going like this," Svim clarified. "This path we're on, it's not going to work. When we planned this out, we were counting on having Silver Lake on our side. Now we don't, and no amount of increased enthusiasm and minor adjustments is going to make up for it. I know you're still under the impression of what Panicseth told you, but something has to change. At this rate we're simply blundering into an obvious failure." Zorian stared at Svim for a second before glancing at Alanik. However, the scarred battle priest was silent, simply staring back at him without saying a word. Clearly he agreed with Svim's words, then. They had probably discussed things between each other before approaching him. He looked around the room instead of immediately answering. It gave him a way to stall and gather his thoughts, but he was also curious about people's reactions to the conversation. They were inside one of the Novita Estates rooms, and there were quite a few people gathered here. Most of them pretended to be absorbed into their own work, but Zorian could tell that all of them were paying close attention to what was happening. Well, except for Zack. His fellow time traveler was sitting cross-legged on the floor with his eyes closed, trying to sense the divine energies of his divine blessing and controller marker. Zorian was not sure why he was doing that, to be honest. Both he and Zack had already succeeded at perceiving these divine energies, and it was unlikely he would develop the skill much in what little time they had left before the end of the restart. On top of that, they had basically given up on trying to modify the temporary markers. There was little point to that now. He took a deep breath but resisted the urge to sigh. They had informed the whole group about their second encounter with Panicseth and what it meant for Zorian. Strangely, the group took another bout of bad news in stride. In fact, the knowledge that Zorian now shared fates with them seemed to significantly improve the mood of the group. He was one of them now, and the fact that he didn't panic and break down after finding out this was his last chance to live seemed to inspire them somewhat and calm their fears. They worked harder, grumbled less, and were less dubious about his motives and logic. For a while, he thought that would be enough, that with some renewed enthusiasm and some clever workaround they would be able to make up for Silver Lake's absence and proceed as planned. However, Svim and Alanik were right. This wasn't going to work. They needed a new plan. "What are you suggesting?" Zorian asked them. "First of all, we should tell Cranton and his team that we're time travelers," Svim said. "Wouldn't that be rather counterproductive?" Zorian asked. "Cranton and his team have been remarkably cooperative with us, all things considered. If they knew the truth, I imagine their enthusiasm for helping us could only plummet as a response." "I said we should tell them we're time travelers, not the full and total truth," Svim said. "Truthfully, they already suspect this. The documents we are providing them with are too similar to their own existing work for that to escape their notice. They have been talking amongst themselves about our identity for a while now, and the most common theory is that we're literally from the future. It isn't that far from the truth, really. They actually hit upon such a crazy theory as the most likely one?" Zorian asked, surprised. "They're working in a time magic research facility," Svim said. "Even though actual time travel is said to be impossible, the topic is likely to come up with some regularity among the staff. They are being paid to push the boundaries of time magic as much as they can, after all." Zorian stayed quiet for a few seconds, mulling things over. He supposed the idea was workable, all things considered, and it might eliminate some of the inefficiencies they'd encountered when working with Cranton and his team. However, although this would be useful, I'm not really sure it would do that much, Zorian said finally. The facility staff is already working hard on the project of turning the Imperial Orb into a black room. Even with their limited information, they seem appreciative enough for the funding and opportunities we've given them. I doubt we could drive them to work harder with this. No, probably not, Svim agreed, propping his elbows on the table and folding his fingers into a triangle shape in front of him. This is merely an attempt to make them fine with the second step of the plan. Which is? Zorian prompted, feeling just a little bit apprehensive all of a sudden. Kidnapping everyone skilled and possibly useful and forcing them to work for us, Svim stated calmly, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Must resist the urge to sigh. Must resist the urge to sigh. Must resist. Zorian rubbed his chin in a frustrated manner before focusing back on the two people in front of him. Alanik was still not saying anything. They were both staring at him and waiting for a response. And just how, Zorian began. Through any means necessary, Svim said, cutting him off. Blackmail. Threats of death and bodily harm. Rampant use of mind magic. My mind magic is not that capable, Zorian said, frowning. The kind of work we need from them has never been done before. They would need to work with us to invent entirely new spells and rituals. I know, Svim said. I can't force someone to perform creative work for me with mind magic, Zorian pointed out. I don't think anyone can. At best we'd get a bunch of dazed zombies. They don't know that, though, Svim said. Mind magic is terrifying, even for mages, and few people are experienced enough to guess your limits. Ignoring that, what you can do is already terrifying enough for most people. If you demonstrated your memory manipulation abilities, most people would be very intimidated. Even I'm afraid of you sometimes, and I'm both familiar with your limitations and relatively certain you will not target me with your abilities. Finally, even if someone is not intimidated by your ability, you can always use your memory modification abilities as a limited retry button for convincing people. You've used your powers in that manner before, I am told. But only on enemies, stressed Zorian. And I'm very grateful you retain that sense of morality and restraint in regards to your powers, Svim said patiently. But we're running out of time and desperate times call for desperate measures. Don't think we're just selfishly asking you to discard your ideals. This is a burden we're all willing to take upon our shoulders. Zorian gave him a surprised look. Somebody will need to keep this mass of resentful, forcibly recruited mages in line and focused on their duties instead of plotting our downfall, Svim said. That's going to be our job. Your job is simply to gather the people we need and intimidate them into cooperating with us, however reluctantly. Zorian stared at the man for a while, considering what he had been told. Svim was essentially saying that all or most of the other temporary loopers already agreed that this was an acceptable course of action. That they were just going to kidnap random people and force them into working for them. And here Zorian was thinking he was being too carefree about reaching for the darker, unethical methods to tackle their problems. Well, he said. I see we're turning into a proper villainous organization. All we need now is a mystical artifact that will allow us to remake the world in our image and we're set to go. Svim's lips twitched slightly. If you really think about it, he said, a large group of people armed with knowledge of things to come and all the things we've gathered in the time loop would be more than enough to. Please don't, Zorian implored him. Just tell me once again how this is supposed to work. All right, Svim said, reaching into his bag and handing him a map with a bunch of locations marked on it. Colorful paper notes densely filled with text were pinned next to each of the indicated locations. Our main problem right now is that we don't have enough time, Svim continued after Zorian had a chance to glance at the map. The only way we're going to get that is by pushing our Black Room modification project to its utter limit. Therefore, we should drop virtually everything and focus on that. However, the biggest problem the project has is the lack of qualified mages to work on it. Most of us are not really qualified to help with it. However, this facility is not the only one of its kind. There are other facilities in other countries, and though they have not gotten as far as the one in Eldamar, their staff is no less qualified than Cranton and his researchers. They just suffer from a lack of funding and opportunities. The places on the map marked with blue upturned triangles were locations of all known Black Room projects in Altazia, Zorian realized. He knew about these, of course. They had been making use of their facilities for quite some time now. Not just in the sense that they were using them to extend their time in the restarts, either. They had long ago raided these places for any information about time magic, as well as handed them collected research notes from other facilities to see if they would come up with something novel when presented with such information. Although these initiatives were moderately successful, they had stopped yielding results by now, and so they no longer bothered with them. They simply made use of the facilities in each restart and then left them alone. Although these places were much smaller than the time magic research facility beneath Scioria, there was a fair number of them. If they forcibly took all their staff, that would be a lot of people. Plus, there might be some useful equipment there, now that he was thinking about it. If they were raiding these places for people, they might as well take everything that wasn't nailed down as well. So we just raid those places, taking everything and everyone in sight, Zorian said, clacking his tongue. What about those who just won't cooperate, no matter what carrot and stick we use? Kill them? Push them through a portal to Blantyre and strand them in the jungle for a while, Svim said. I think most will reconsider after a few days, but if not, they can just spend the rest of the month there. And probably get eaten by a flying snake or something, Zorian thought, though he did not say it out loud. In any case, with this sudden influx of new people and with Cranton's hopeful acceptance of our time traveler story, we can then move on to the next step, said Svim, handing him another map. This one was a very detailed map of the underworld beneath Scioria, centered around the time magic research facility. However, the facility in the map Svim gave him was larger than the one that currently existed beneath their feet. Much, much larger. It was a huge, sprawling complex that circled the whole like a giant torus and then extended into the surrounding land through a spider web of rooms and corridors. Zorian gave Svim a dubious look. There is no way this kind of development can be hidden from the city, Zorian said dubiously. Never mind Cranton and his reaction, this would bring the Eldamar military on our heads. Do we really have enough influence to make the city authorities overlook this sort of thing? Yes, that is certainly a problem. Svim tapped his fingers together and looked away uneasily for a second. We think we have a solution for that, though. I'm not going to like this, am I? Zorian asked rhetorically. Can it really be worse than the whole mass kidnapping thing? We should work with the esoteric order of the Celestial Dragon and its leaders, Svim told him. Zorian scowled at the suggestion. He had nothing but disgust and contempt for the cult of the World Dragon. At least Ebasans had a relatively understandable goal of sabotaging their national enemies. The cultists were traitors and seemed to operate purely on a mixture of delusion and insatiable greed for power. Most of the lower-level members didn't even know what exactly they were fighting for. Plus, he could never quite forget the sight of the shifter children they sacrificed in order to crack open Panicseth's prison. He did not like the idea of cooperating with these people in the slightest. You can't be serious, Zorian told him, voice tinged with annoyance. I really am serious, and not just because they can help us make the city authorities look the other way while we rearrange the local underworld in our favor. With the loss of Silver Lake, we have lost our expert on the primordials and their cages. Aside from Silver Lake, the cult's leaders are probably the people most qualified to help us understand Panicseth's prison and how to exploit it to get out of the time loop, Svim explained. We already took everything they had, Zorian pointed out. In fact, they had been exceptionally thorough in raiding the cult for every secret they had. Zorian may have compunctions about delving into the minds of random people to steal their secrets, but he had no such compunctions about the cultists. He could not claim to have gotten every scrap of knowledge they had, since he could only look for things if he knew what to look for, but he was quite sure he got everything truly important out of them. What they already have, yes, Svim said. But not what they could have, if we teach them all we know and give them a chance to look at the problem with increased skills and perspective. Zorian's eyes widened in realization. You want to teach them? He asked, aghast at the idea. Everything, yes, Svim confirmed, nodding. We would not inform them about the time loop, of course, but other than that, we will bring them into our improved black room and teach them everything we can about divination, about dimensionalism and about the structure of the primordial prison in the whole. We will then let them analyze the structure and either ask them to answer our questions or you can just rip the answers straight out of their minds. It depends on how cooperative they are and what is more convenient. Zorian remained silent for a while. On one hand, he really didn't like the idea of teaching these people anything, especially since that would involve them being close by for several months, plenty of time for things to go seriously wrong. On the other hand, he found the idea of the cultists unknowingly helping them get out of the time loop so they could sabotage their plans in the real world to be rather amusing. And Svim was right that, other than Silver Lake, these people were the ones most familiar with the Primordial's prison. They had been studying it for quite a while now in their attempt to open it, after all. There was, of course, a small matter of why in the world would the cult leaders agree to work with them on this. However, they were already considering kidnapping people and using blackmail and intimidation to make them cooperate, so this was probably not as difficult of an issue as it appeared. They just had to point out that the invasion could not possibly succeed unless Zack and Zorian allowed it to happen, and then prove their words with a demonstration of their power. He looked at Alanik, who had still not said anything up until now. I'm surprised you're willing to entertain this idea, Zorian told him. I was willing to work with Silver Lake, wasn't I? Alanik said. She may not have done anything particularly heinous in front of you, but I assure you she has done plenty of odious deeds in the past. I understand the necessity. It would be playing with fire, but it isn't like this is the first time we're doing that. Isn't it? Indeed, Zorian said quietly. He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Alanik never really talked about his past with Silver Lake, or of his time before he became a priest. Zorian had long figured out by now that the scarred battle priest had been a very different man back then, and did a lot of things he later regretted, so he refrained from pushing the man on the topic. Alanik had been incredibly helpful towards him throughout all these restarts, and Zorian felt it would be ungrateful of him to dredge up painful memories and old grudges unless he really had to. If Alanik had some information about Silver Lake that he felt was important, he would have told them about it by now. After a while, Zorian picked up a pen and threw it at Zack's head. Though he had his eyes firmly closed, Zack immediately raised his hand and caught the pen out of the air before opening his eyes. How much did you hear? Zorian asked him. Most of it, Zack admitted. And? Zorian prompted. What do you think? I don't have any better idea, Zack said with a shrug. Neither did Zorian, in all honesty. Well, that wasn't entirely true. All right, said Zorian, rising from his seat. I guess we're doing this, then. However, I think a slight modification is in order. Slight, huh? Zack said with a grin. If we're going to get the maximum amount of time out of the modified black room, the extra manpower is not enough, said Zorian. We need a dimensionalism mage of the highest caliber if we're going to get truly spectacular results. So. Those don't exactly grow on trees, Zack pointed out, throwing the pen back at him. Where are we going to find one of those? Zorian caught the pen flying at him with practiced ease. How attached are you to that crown we took from Quadakikl? Zorian asked Zack with a knowing smile. Zack's expression immediately fell. Oh, you can't be serious, Zack complained. Oh, but he was. He really was. Come on, Zorian told him, motioning him to get up from the floor. Let's go talk to our favorite lich. Somewhere in Eldamar, a field was burning. Two masked teenagers were engaged in a vicious fight against an ancient Abasan lich, and the landscape around them was devastated in their passing. Once this had been a wheat field in full bloom, but it was now just an ashen land covered in craters. Broken remains of undead servants and golems littered the ground, and strange rock formations rose out of the ground in places where the two sides tried to entomb each other in solid stone. Somewhere out there, Zorian mused, a farmer was going to be very devastated when he saw what had happened to his harvest. This was the third time he and Zack had clashed with the Lich like this in the last few days. However, this was fine as far as Zorian was concerned. He considered this to be simply a part of their negotiation with Quatakikl, rather than as a waste of time. They were proving to the Lich that they were legitimate threats and that he should take them seriously. Earlier, when they had taken the crown from him in this restart, they had done it through an ambush and by employing something that could be dismissed as a mere trick. Through these fights, they were showing Quatakikl there was more to them than that. Quatakikl had never stopped looking for them all this time, of course. He had no idea it was Zack and Zorian who had stolen his crown, since they had worn disguises when they had ambushed him and covered their tracks extremely well, but he had somehow managed to find out about the existence of their group in general. He seemed to have identified Svim, Alanik, Ilsa and Kiran as the leaders of the group, possibly because they interacted with the authorities relatively often. He had tried to target them by ransacking their homes and such, but this hadn't been very effective. All temporary loopers had vacated their usual homes by now, and were not that easy to catch. Plus, he couldn't be too brazen about wrecking things or he would put his own invasion plans into danger. This sort of situation must have been rather frustrating for the ancient Lich, because he had attacked them immediately when they had shown up in front of him again. He hadn't even given them a chance to speak. Rude. A giant, scintillating ball of red light screamed through the air toward Zorian. He thrust his hand at it, causing a conical wave of barely visible rainbow light to wash over it. It unraveled instantly, revealing a dimmer, but much more dangerous arrow of green energies hurtling at his chest. The simulacrum standing beside him immediately thrust his arm into the path of the arrow, sacrificing it to shield Zorian from the blow. The arm exploded at the mere touch of the magical projectile, negating the attack but showering Zorian with a rain of metal shrapnel. Zorian didn't try to defend himself against the flying metal pieces, opting to keep casting his counterattack instead. The shrapnel was stopped by his shield, a faint honeycomb pattern momentarily becoming visible around him as it absorbed the attack, and then Zorian finished his spell. Nothing visibly happened, but this was because his projectiles were utterly invisible. A pair of circular discs of severing force made their way towards the Lich, who was currently busy dodging massive boulders and fireballs that Zack was sending his way. Beside them, Princess released a loud roar into the air with 6 of her many heads, the last 2 being busy chewing through the throat of a giant eagle she managed to snatch straight out of the air. The great bird hung limply from her jaws, its riders nowhere to be seen. The fight had been going on for long enough that an Eldamarian response group had reached them and tried to involve themselves into the fight. Unfortunately for them, neither group had appreciated their interference. Their eagle riders had lost at least half of their numbers. One could see the charred husks of their eagles and mages mixed among the wreckage of the battlefield if one looked closely enough. The remaining eagles now circled uneasily in the sky above, keeping their distance and simply observing things. Several sites in the distance were also smoking. These were the places where Eldamarian forces had tried to set up artillery positions to pick them off from a distance. Quatakikl hadn't liked that idea, though, and after he had finished wiping them all out, they did not bother trying a second attempt at it. Zack shouted an order at Princess, and she roughly threw the dead eagle aside and disappeared. Well, teleported to be more exact. She reappeared instantly at Quatakikl's side, where she instantly tried biting and trampling him. Even the ancient Lich had trouble putting down such a large, regenerating beast, especially when Zack and Zorian were there keeping him from being able to focus solely on dealing with her. Distracted as he was by the Hydra and Zack, Quatakikl did not notice the severing discs until it was too late and ended up losing one of his arms. This, in turn, placed him at an even bigger disadvantage and forced him to burn through a lot of his mana reserves to fend them off and stabilize himself. Now that he had no imperial crown on him, his mana reserves were no longer quite as ridiculous as they once were. He could no longer just outlast them by default. Now Zack proudly wore the crown to battle, which meant it was Quadakikl who had to worry about a war of attrition. The battle continued on for another 5 minutes before eventually slowing down. Eventually, the two sides found themselves staring at each other over an expanse of barren land, waiting for the other to make a move. Zack and Zorian could press their advantage, of course, but that would only cause the Lich to flee. There was no point to that, really. The seconds slowly ticked by with nothing to show for it. The only sounds were occasional screeching of giant eagles circling overhead and Princess hissing at them and at Quadakikl in response. "Hey," Zack finally said, his voice magically distorted and his face hidden behind a blank white mask. He pulled the imperial crown off his head and twirled it around his finger playfully. "Are you looking for this?" Quadakikl's response was to fire one of his signature red disintegration beams at him. However, Zack did not move a finger to dodge or block it. The beam just curved unnaturally around him and missed. "We might be willing to give it back," Zorian pointed out, his voice also distorted. "Or we can just continue this for another couple of days, I guess," Zack added. "I don't know about you, but I kind of enjoy these clashes between us. A bit of excitement to spice up the day, you know." "So. You want to talk, huh?" Quadakikl observed. He looked up at the Eldamar eagle riders circling above. "This probably isn't the best place to do it, though." "Pick a time and place, then," Zack said. "Just don't keep us waiting for too long. We're on a bit of a time limit here. You drag your feet too much and we'll just keep the crown and be done with it." Quadakikl didn't bother answering him. He simply picked up a rock from the ground and squeezed it in his skeletal hand. Bright orange lines burned themselves into the surface of the rock before fading away. The Lich then threw the rock at their feet and then teleported away. Zorian picked the rock up. It was still warm, and there was a time and address carved into it. Plus a single sentence at the end. "Don't be late." Zorian had no intention of telling Quadakikl about the time loop or trying to talk him into helping them get out. That would obviously just blow up in their faces. The ancient Lich had no motivation to sabotage the plans of his original self by helping them escape into the real world. The last time he'd realized he was just a copy in a duplicate world, he'd had no compunctions whatsoever about sacrificing himself to advance the cause of his original by crippling them. A person like that wouldn't help them just to save his own hide, and they had nothing to really offer him. But they did not have to tell him about the time loop. They did not have to ask him to help them to escape. What they needed at the moment was more time, and to get that they needed their Black Room project to succeed. And with Quadakikl's help, it could very well succeed spectacularly. At the moment, they were in a private room in one of Sioria's many restaurants, discussing this idea with the Abasan leader. Quadakikl was in his human disguise, and Zack and Zorian had agreed to come unmasked as a show of trust. "So let me get this straight," Quadakikl said, playing around with his glass. "You want me to help you improve Eldamar's time dilation room to a completely ridiculous rate of dilation. Specifically, we need another 5 months, Zack said, cutting into his speech. "And in exchange you are going to give me my own crown back," finished Quadakikl, pretending he didn't hear him. "Doesn't that strike you as incredibly brazen and a foolish thing to ask for?" "I mean, I will get that crown back. It's just a matter of time." "See, that's where you're wrong," said Zack. "Zorian, do your thing." Zorian nodded and started casting the gate spell. Quadakikl was instantly on guard, but he only tensed imperceptibly and did not attack them or voice any protest. He watched curiously as Zorian finished casting the spell and opened a miniature dimensional gate just above his palm. If one looked closely, they could see a featureless patch of water by looking through the gate. "Well done," Quadakikl said dubiously. "You can cast the gate spell. Not something many people can brag about, but..." "Scan it," Zack told him. See where it leads. Frowning, Quadakikl did just that, casting a bunch of divinations to determine the location of the other side of the portal. After a full 2 minutes of tinkering, he leaned back in his chair and gave Zack a strange look. It's just a random patch of the ocean, as far as I can see. Very far away from any land, he said. Precisely, Zack said, grinning from ear to ear. Now what do you think would happen if we just chucked this crown through that portal and closed it? Quadakikl's eyes widened in shock and realization. The truth was that the deep sea was utterly unreachable from the perspective of humanity. Even the most powerful of mages would have no hopes of finding something that had been thrown away into the middle of the ocean. Even a lich like Quadakikl, who had no need to breathe and potentially lived forever, would balk at the idea of searching through the ocean floor for a needle in a haystack. If Zack and Zorian really did pick a random spot in the ocean, far away from any land, and threw the crown there, it would be scarcely different from destroying it utterly. You wouldn't, Quadakikl said severely. The value of that crown. If we can't get this black room to work, we're dead, Zack said, leaning forward towards the lich. There, I said it. We're desperate and our lives literally depend on this working. So if we fail, this crown is utterly useless to us. Why keep it around, then? Anyone we give it to would just become a target for you. Better to throw it into the sea so you can't have it. You, said Quadakikl, speechless for a moment. He shook his head. I see. So I either get the crown back from you now or I lose it forever. Is that what you're saying? That is what we're saying, Zack said, leaning back into his chair with a bright smile. Besides, don't pretend you aren't interested in the black rooms and that helping us with this is just a chore for you, Zorian pointed out. We know for a fact that you have been interested in the time magic research facility beneath Scioria for quite some time. Black room projects require a great deal of funding and manpower to be developed, and Ulquin Abesa is probably not very abundant in either. This is a bit unfortunate since, as a place full of undead, you are the nation most able to exploit this sort of thing to its full potential. No need to worry about lifespan limits if you don't age. And you definitely need every advantage you can get, if you are to really compete with Eldamar and other Altasian powers. Am I right? Maybe, said Quadakikl after a short pause. You're saying I would get all the information regarding the Eldamarian Black Room project? How else can we expect you to help us improve it? Zorian asked. However, you're thinking too small. It's not just the Eldamarian project that you would have access to. It's also the Sulamnon project, and the Falkrinian projects, and everyone's project. Every Black Room project on the continent. He took out a bright red folder out of his bag and handed it to Quadakikl. It did not hold any comprehensive notes, of course, but it held enough to make it clear what kind of information Zack and Zorian had at their disposal. Quadakikl leafed through the folder, slowly at first but picking up as he saw more and more. His eyebrows also got higher and higher as he got closer to the end. "This, how did you even get this?" he asked them. He sounded honestly impressed. "We raided every Black Room facility on the continent and stole their notes and research data," Zorian said. Quadakikl hummed lightly. "I guess this really is very important to you." They spent the next 15 minutes discussing the details of the proposed agreement. Though Quadakikl never really agreed to anything and did his best to look uninterested, Zorian could tell they were gradually winning him over. "So, there is one thing I'm really concerned about here," the ancient lich finally said. "If I agree to this and help you as we agreed, what motive do you have to honor your part of the deal in the end?" "Yes, I will admit a certain amount of interest in the information you have about Black Rooms, but the crown you stole from me is the real issue. What guarantee do I have that you'll actually hand it over to me at the end?" "If you agree to help us, we will hand you the crown right now," Zorian said. Quadakikl raised his eyebrow at them. He had been doing that a lot in this conversation. "Yes, really," Zorian confirmed. Zack had already used the key to unbar the gate. Now the only value of the imperial items was in their basic abilities, and while the crown was extremely useful they needed Quatakikle's help far more at the moment. They could always steal the crown the original was wearing when they got to the real world. What makes you think I won't just take the crown and walk away laughing? Quatakikle asked curiously. You could do that, yes, Zack said. We don't think you will, though. You are an honorable kind of undead. Ha! I don't know whether to feel pleased my reputation is so good or look down on you for being so foolish, the Lich said. Does that mean you agree to the deal? Zack asked him. Let me ask you a question, the Abasin leader said. What actually made you think you could work with me on this? I mean, yes, you clearly looked into me for quite some time before making your move. You even did that without me becoming aware that someone was plotting against me, and some part of me cannot help but be impressed by that. However, it still seems very strange you feel confident enough to propose this deal. Seems very risky. We live a very risky life, Zack said, grinning. Yet you're still alive, the Lich noted with a more subdued smile of his own. Clearly it is not just a matter of overconfidence, then. If we answer this question for you, will you answer one of ours? Zorian asked him. Sure, Quatakikle said, waving his hand in front of him carelessly. Ask away. Why are you working with the cult of the World Dragon to release the primordial trapped in Scioria? Zorian asked. I refuse to believe someone like you would be ignorant of what exactly you are tangling with. This is not some fancy summon that will go away in a few hours, nor is it just a powerful monster. This is a creature that even the gods had trouble killing. Why would you set that thing loose on the world? I can see a regular rogue mage not caring about the consequences much, but surely you do. You have a homeland you care deeply for, and you probably intend to be alive for a very long time from now. Forever, Quatakikle said. I intend to live forever. Then why? Zorian asked. Why release a godlike entity that could very well destroy everything in a few centuries? The Lich looked at him for a few seconds, looking amused. Haha, the Lich laughed. So. You do know about the whole invasion business I'm a part of? Yes, Zack confirmed. We do. As I expected, Quatakikle responded. I guess that kind of answers my question, doesn't it? If you know about the invasion plot, you already know I'm willing to enter into highly risky and insane deals if the benefits are big enough. But anyway, about your question, the thing is, I don't think the primordial is going to be allowed to run free that long. Never mind centuries, I don't think it is going to last 2 weeks. Why? Zack asked, frowning. Because I have faith in the angels, the Lich said. What? Sounds strange to have someone like me say that, doesn't it? Quatakikle said, smiling knowingly. It's true, though. The gods may be gone, but the angels are still around, and I have no doubt they would do everything in their power to either reseal or kill the primordial. Their restrictions limit their ability to meddle in the physical world, so it's easy to underestimate them, but they have some truly awe-inspiring beings and weapons on their side. I should know, I saw them personally fighting a few times. One primordial should not be impossible for them to handle. So you want to free the primordial, knowing the angels would take care of it long before it becomes your problem, Zorian said. Yes, the Lich confirmed. Frankly, my main worry is not that the angels will not be able to handle it. My main worry is that they will take care of it too quickly and that the damage from its release and subsequent rampage will be too limited in scope. I ordered all the temples razed to the ground at the very beginning of the invasion, but I fear it may not be enough. The angels can be surprisingly subtle and underhanded when they want to be. For all I know, they may be working against me even now. He had no idea. We are actually really fortunate, Quatakikle continued, sounding very smug. It is likely that the ability of the angels to interfere with our plans is even more limited due to the recent complications in the spiritual spheres. You mean the fact all communications with the spiritual world have been severed lately? Zorian asked. Very well informed, indeed, Quada mumbled quietly. Yes, that. It's rather unplanned, but not unwelcome. You could say the very heavens are helping me, haha. A small silence descended on the scene. So, Zack said. Do we have a deal or not? I suppose we do, the Lich said. I must be going senile in my old age, but I'll give you a chance. Oh yeah, one more thing, Zorian said. We kind of also approached the esoteric order of the Celestial Dragon about this and some other things. Unfortunately, they have been more unreasonable about this than you have, so we have kind of ended up kidnapping them. He threw a small painting on the table. It was very realistic, depicting a group of bound and gagged men. There was no proof that the picture was real, of course, but Quada frowned when he saw it and stayed silent. Since we're working together now, we were hoping you could help us convince them to cooperate, Zorian said. At the very least, we need their help to make this deal between us actually work. Otherwise, I fear we'll be forced to subject them to our intense cooperation techniques. Of course the incompetent idiots got captured, Quada muttered. He threw the picture onto the table before giving them a more cautious, speculative look. He then thrust his hand towards them, palm pointing upwards. The crown, he demanded, shaking his hand. With a sigh, Zack reached towards one of his pockets and pulled out the imperial crown. He gave it a look of sad longing before slowly and carefully placing it in Quada palm. The Lich immediately placed the crown on the top of his head, a web of geometric lines immediately lighting up all over his skin and flashing dangerously. For a moment his disguise dropped and his black skeletal form became plainly visible, but then he was back to normal and his human guise was intact. The crown was no longer visible, hidden under whatever magic Quada used to keep himself looking like a living being. Right, he said. Take me to those clowns and I'll talk to them. They'll cooperate. Things developed very quickly after that. Zorian was honestly surprised how well things turned out. He was afraid the kidnapped mages would refuse to work or drag their feet whenever possible. He was afraid Quada would just take the crown and just leave them to their devices while laughing at their stupidity. He was afraid the cult leaders would sabotage everything out of spite, resentful that they had been basically arm-twisted into agreeing with their plans. None of these things happened. The kidnapped researchers mostly chose to work with them instead of being defiant. A surprising number of them were even enthusiastic about the project, once they realized what they had been recruited to work on. It probably helped that Zack and Zorian promised them they could take all the documentation related to the project back home with them when they were finished. Though somewhat skeptical about that, the sheer scale of the project seemed to put people at ease. There was no way they would kill so many people just to shut everyone up, right? Quada was a skeleton of his word. Just like he had never tried to cheat them after agreeing to teach them his magical skills, he did not attempt to get out of helping with the project once he committed to it. Which was great, because his help was insanely helpful and they would never have gotten as far as they did without him. He was more than just a replacement for Silver Lake, he was vastly better than her, and Zorian was honestly kind of sorry they couldn't recruit him to work on the time loop exit project as well. With his help, their odds would have improved immensely. Alas, the idea of informing him about the time loop was still as foolish as it always had been. Even if Red Robe had left the time loop thanks to a deal with Panicseth, he still had to find a way to make his temporary marker last past the 6-month time limit, Zorian told Zack when they were discussing the topic at one point. You think it wasn't Panicseth who helped him modify that? Zack asked. Maybe it did, but I doubt the Primordial actually did any modification itself. It may have given Red Robe clues and instructions, but he still needed to find someone to do that for him. And you think that someone was Quada Zack guessed. Yes, Zorian confirmed. Yet, if Quada helped Red Robe acquire a permanent marker, why would he not acquire one himself? Perhaps he couldn't, offered Zack. I mean, the fact that temporary markers do not work on people for 6 restarts after the previous temporary marker runs out clearly indicates it's not the marker that does the counting. It's the sovereign gate and the guardian of the threshold. So? Zorian asked. So that means modifying a temporary marker has to be done before the sovereign gate processes it in some way. In all likelihood, that means any change to them must be made before the restart in which they gained the marker ends. We know from your example that the Guardian can only do certain things at the end of the restart, and this is probably one of them. This would also explain why we never managed to figure out a way to modify them that worked. The moment that first restart ended, the chance was lost, and we never even realized it. Ah, Zorian said. That did make a lot of sense. So you think Quadakikl was already a temporary looper for a while before Red Robe entered? I don't know. I'm just throwing the idea out there, I guess, Zack said with a shrug. What do you think happened? I think maybe Quadakikl didn't even want to leave the time loop, even if he found out about it, Zorian said. I mean, definitely not through a method Red Robe and Silver Lake used. Entering into a death pact with a primordial? Not a chance. And physically leaving on your own is very hard. I don't think even Quadakikl could have pulled it off, considering the amount of effort we had to put into it. Perhaps he simply made a deal with Red Robe, similar to what I have with Svim, Kale and the others. Once he gets out, he gives Quadakikl a mountain of notes and other information, and in exchange he helps modify Red Robe's marker. He could have still demanded a temporary marker of his own and modified that, Zack pointed out. Just in case, you know. Yeah, I guess, Zorian said after a while. I don't know. Maybe it's as you say, and he just couldn't. I could see Panicseth giving Red Robe a very specific solution tailored for him alone. It probably doesn't want anyone getting out without making a deal with him. Their interaction with the cult of the World Dragon was very adversarial at first. For one thing, they had kidnapped them and blackmailed them into working with them, so it was inevitable they were not too enthusiastic about cooperating. It also didn't help that Zorian evacuated all the shifters out of the city and informed the cult leadership that no child sacrifice would be allowed in their attempt to free Panicseth from his prison. That led to a lot of shouting and even a brief exchange of combat spells. However, the cult leaders would ultimately see the light when Zack and Zorian showed them the Sovereign Gate. They did not explain to the cultists what the object exactly did, but they did tell them it was a divine artifact that contained some of the essence of Panicseth itself and could thus be used as a key to open Panicseth's prison. A much better key than the shifter blood essence they originally planned to use for the purpose, too. Though their description was deceptive, the basic facts were entirely true within the reality of the time loop. The Sovereign Gate could very much be used as a key to open Panicseth's prison. In fact, using the Sovereign Gate was the key part of their plan to exit the time loop. This had been true while they had Silver Lake's cooperation, and it was true now. Zorian had been a little worried that the cultists would figure out too much if given access to the Sovereign Gate, but thankfully that never happened. They were overjoyed with it, but only because it was a better, fancier key to releasing Panicseth out of its prison. They never realized what was truly going on inside of it. Considering it was a divine artifact, and that those were notoriously hard to figure out, Zorian probably shouldn't have been surprised at that. In any case, their plans went off flawlessly. Better than they could have hoped, even. They had dug up a massive underground facility, reshaped the entire local geomantic web to fuel its creation, and then surrounded the Imperial Orb with layers upon layers of complicated wards and barriers made out of extremely expensive materials. The cost of the whole project was enough to bankrupt a small country and would give even a major nation like Eldamar and Falcrinia pause if they had to pay for it. By the end of it, even Quadakikl seemed to be getting a little uneasy at the amount of resources and effort being put into this thing. It didn't matter though, because he stayed true to his word and the project was finished on time. 6 days before the end of the restart, the improved Black Room was done. A large throng of people time loopers, cult leaders, and the more enthusiastic of the kidnapped researchers piled on into the Imperial Orb, and then the time dilation was activated. They would spend the next 5 months inside the Imperial Orb. Outside, a single day would pass. Quetzalcoatl did not join them in the orb, despite helping them make it. This was smart of him, because Zack and Zorian would have killed him the moment the orb was isolated from the outside world and stolen his crown again. Zorian wasn't sure whether Quetzalcoatl could have escaped back to his phylactery if he was killed inside the palace orb, but even if he could they wouldn't care. The important thing was that he could not escape when overpowered inside the orb, and that having him inside for the full 5 months was too much of a risk. The cult leaders were manageable. Someone like Quetzalcoatl wasn't. In any case, the next 5 months would consist of improving everyone's skills so they could help with the final exit plan, manufacturing the necessary ward stones and blueprints to prepare the terrain, and so on. It would be a bit of a challenge to hide the true meaning of all the preparations from the cult leaders and the like, but Zorian was not opposed to simply killing them if they ended up revealing too much to them, so whatever. Zorian had another thing he wanted to do, though. Something he wanted to keep hidden from most people including Zack. Thus, he gathered most of the Arania loopers, plus Svim and Daimen, and brought them to one of the isolated corners of the orb dimension for a talk. "What a strange group you have gathered," Svim remarked. "It seems you are still not satisfied with your mind magic skills, if I am reading the situation correctly." "Seriously?" Daimen complained. "Aren't you good enough at that, already?" "You can never get good enough at mind magic," one of the Arania responded. "Indeed," Zorian said. "It's my best skill, and it's good to keep working on those. However, I didn't bring you here to work on my general mind magic skills. What I want is to figure out a way to get past the mind blank spell and target a person with mind magic anyway." A look of realization entered everyone's eyes. Even the Arania, their body language was a little hard to read, but Zorian had gotten a feeling for it by now. Then they all got to work. The escape attempt had to happen at the end of the month, on the day of the summer festival. The reasoning for this was identical to the one the Abasins and the cultists used to launch their invasion at that particular moment in time. This was the peak of the planetary alignment, when dimensionalism magic was at its strongest. When the group left the Imperial Orb, only 5 days remained until the deadline. This was not much, but it was enough to make the necessary preparations. The time magic research facility was completely repurposed into a part of the exit ritual. Large sections of the whole were covered in carved spell formula and embedded with strange metallic ward stones. The cultists they had spent 5 months training in dimensionalism and divinations had analyzed Panaxetha's prison and shared their results with the group. They seemed honestly grateful to Zack and Zorian for the help they had given them, which made Zorian feel just a little bit guilty about intending to utterly betray them in the end. Not enough for him to do anything differently, but still. Sadly, the final plan they had agreed upon had some unfortunate details. The original plan was to use Panaxetha's prison as a bridge, opening a dimensional gate that would connect a spot in the time loop with the same spot in the real world. That plan was now largely unworkable. Silver Lake had been the only one who knew how to interact with the Primordial's prison with sufficient finesse to make that possible. Despite their best efforts in trying to develop that skill in some of their people, they had failed to duplicate her feats. It did not help that they obviously could not experiment on the primordial prison itself while inside the Imperial Orb. They could only work on their general dimensionalism skills and try to guess what was necessary to interact with it properly. Still, while the original plan was no longer possible, they did have an alternative. It was just that this plan required them to crack open Panaxetha's prison and then sacrifice the Imperial Orb to serve as a bridge they needed to connect the two realities. There were 2 problems with this. The first was that it required them to destabilize the Primordial's prison and make a crack in it, something that usually triggered a premature end to the restart and would allow Panaxeth to extend its influence outside the prison while they attempted to form the bridge. This would be solved by enclosing the area with multiple layers of dimensional membranes, so that even after breaching its prison, Panicseth would not be truly free. They weren't totally sure it would work, but it was the best idea they had and the theory was sound. Even if it worked, though, it would only stop the restart from ending immediately. It would do nothing to stop Panicseth from rampaging about. The other was that using the Imperial Orb that way meant they couldn't take it with them to the real world. It would have to stay behind to form a path for them, which would sharply limit the amount of things they could bring with them from the time loop, as well as result in the total loss of all of the research notes and blueprints Zorian had stored in its memory bank. That was painful, to say the least. There was no other choice, however. The Imperial Orb was the only pocket dimension reinforced with divine power that they knew of. It was the only thing they knew of that could withstand the dimensional stresses involved in the procedure. Everything else would break in seconds. Deciding what to bring with them and what to leave behind was stressful and led to a lot of arguments, but somehow they managed to cut their possessions down to a manageable level. Days passed in a flash, until there was no more time. The summer festival was upon them, and the invasion was about to begin. Zack and Zorian had meant to kill all the cult leaders the day before, to make sure they wouldn't interfere with their work, but their unlikely allies surprised them by graciously agreeing to step aside of their own free will. The official reason was that they had figured out that their group planned to release the Primordial 2, and that thus there was no need for them to get involved. Zorian did not believe that for a second, of course. The leadership of the cult wanted to control the Primordial, not just release it. Moreover, Quadakikl was never very far from the cult leaders these days, making direct moves against them impossible. Reluctantly, they decided to let the matter drop. Hopefully the Lich and the cultists would be too busy fighting the city to try and sabotage their operation. They had done their best to covertly prepare the city and its defenders for the upcoming invasion, so the attackers should have their hands full in that regard. They simply made the last round of preparations and then settled down to wait. Everything was ready. Zorian turned to Zack. "If this fails, I'm dead," he told him. Zack shifted uncomfortably. "The Guardian may have been lying for some reason," he said. "Perhaps you will wake up at the start of the next restart and—" "Maybe," said Zorian, cutting him off. He really doubted it, though. "However, it's best to plan for things not being so convenient. Anyway, if everything fails and we all die, it's all up to you. You're our last and only hope." I guess," Zack sighed, looking really pained at the idea of him getting out of this thing alone. "Look, no, this probably sounds hollow, but if anything happens to you, I promise I will take care of your original self, alright?" "That actually does make me feel somewhat better," Zorian said. "Come on. It's starting." The ritual was taking place inside the hole, on a floating platform. There was a raised dais in the center, on which the Sovereign Gate stood. It struck Zorian that this was a very similar setup to the one the cult had used for their ritual. They really had ended up supplanting their role in a way, hadn't they? Of course, the real setup their group was using was much more extensive than what the cultists had used in the past. Though the main ritual grounds consisted of this one floating platform, the supporting mechanisms actually extended throughout the entire local underworld. Additionally, the entire space around them was enclosed in several layers of dimensional membranes that isolated the place from the outside world as much as possible. There would be no plucky trio of mages simply flying up to them in a sphere of white force to disrupt the whole thing from within, like Zack and Zorian had done to the cultists in one of the previous restarts. The entire group arranged itself into a series of 3 concentric circles. Zack, Zorian, Daimen and Svim were at the very center, surrounding the Sovereign Gate. They were the people most skilled in dimensionalism, and thus the most crucial for the effort. Around them were dozens of people who had enough skills to contribute, but not enough to take on the heavy burden that the main 4 were responsible for. Finally, there was the rest of the group who couldn't really help the procedure work, and could only stay back and pray for everyone's success. They were here only because once the area had been enclosed in dimensional membranes, no one could get in without disrupting everything and causing the ritual to fail. Thus, if they wanted to get them outside, they had to be present inside while the ritual took place. After some shouting and pushing, everyone was in their assigned position and, hopefully, knew what to do. They started casting. For the first 5 minutes, nothing much happened. The air above the platform warped and twisted like hot summer air, but nothing more than that occurred. The group had to be exceptionally careful about their spell work and timing, and that meant work was bound to be slow. Still, everything was proceeding well so the walls of the hole shook, sending dust and pebbles everywhere and causing the inscribed spell formula in the walls to flare and flicker with an ominous blue light. A deep rumbling sound emanated from somewhere in the distance, like a growl of a titanic beast. Crap! What the hell was going on outside? What were Catastrophic and the cultists doing? Stay focused. Svim warned. We are at a critical. Another tremor, this one even stronger, shook the entire place and everything suddenly went to hell. The shimmering, controlled breach they were working towards quickly spun out of control, and a pitch-black, irregular crack suddenly manifested itself in the air around them. Shit! Zack swore. Suppress it. Suppress it. But it was too late. A swarm of dark brown tentacles, rope-like and covered in thorns, rushed out of the crack and sent everyone scattering out of their positions. The crack widened, revealing a giant, three-lobed, inhuman eye lurking behind the dimensional barrier, and more tentacles rushed out to confront them. These were thicker, and had rather human-like hands attached at the end. Though things had gone badly, all was not lost. They had made the ritual with certain tolerances, and this was still a manageable outcome. Quickly, many of the people standing around in the third circle of the ritual rushed forwards and started fighting the tentacles. People like Kieran and Taven had no skills with which to help the ritual itself, but they had plenty of combat power and no other duties to distract them. They fearlessly charged into the invading primordial mass, recklessly burning through their mana to keep it away from Zorian and the others. As for Zack and Zorian, they were busy suppressing the breach and could offer very little help. Should their attention lapse for even a second, Panicseth would overwhelm them before they could blink. They frantically dodged the flailing tentacles, shaping and stabilizing the breach into something manageable. Dimly, Zorian was aware that one of the hands that got severed in half by Taven suddenly grew legs and claws and flung itself at her. Taven ended up tackled at the ground, unable to cast much of anything. Kieran managed to blast the thing off of her, but she had to be dragged off to the side, effectively out of the fight. She was also bleeding heavily, leaving a thick trail of blood as she was dragged to the edge of the platform. Zorian had no idea if she was going to live, and couldn't really afford to check at the moment. Not far from there, one of the Arania tried to block one of the thin, thorny tentacles with a force shield but found her defenses to be lacking. The tentacle punched through her shield and swiftly wrapped itself around her torso several times. That's when they found out that the thorns weren't just very sharp, but were also thin and bladed like a razor. The high-pitched scream of the Arania cut off quickly as the thorns effortlessly sliced through her exoskeleton and turned her into a mutilated corpse. The tentacle then picked up the corpse and started waving it around like a bloody flail, sending blood and viscera everywhere. Some of the mages panicked or flinched and the Aranian blood splattered all over them, even if no actual damage was done, and their efforts to keep the breach in check started to fail. Damn it, swore Zorian, reaching into his jacket pocket and removing a handful of steel spheres densely covered in spell formula. He had been hoping to save these for later. He needed them later. But if he didn't use this now, they were done for. He flung the spheres at the rift above and they spontaneously aligned themselves around it into a quickly rotating ring before starting to glow. The primordial's tentacles reacted quickly, switching directions and trying to tear the sphere formation apart, but thankfully the rest of the group immediately realized they could not let that happen. A swarm of multicolored rays, bullets, and more exotic projectiles intercepted the tentacles, halting their charge for a moment. A moment was enough. The spheres erupted into blinding white light, blinding everyone for a moment, and then the rift abruptly shrunk. Some of the tentacles, cut off from the source of their mass by the shrinkage, fell from the sky, crashing onto the platform with a loud thud. Their relief was short-lived, however, since the tentacles soon started twitching and bubbling like boiling water, before starting to merge into an ovoid, chrysalis-like mass. Alanik was the first to act, sending streams of white-hot flames at the forming cocoon, and then everyone joined in. However, the structure seemed to have developed some kind of resistance to the spells they had used on the tentacles thus far, because it was stubbornly resisting attempts to eradicate it. Deep within it, some horrible shape rapidly began to form. And the sovereign gate spontaneously started glowing white, a silhouette of the familiar form of the guardian of the threshold forming right above it. "Shit," Zorian couldn't help but mumble. "Use the orb," Svim said. But Daimen protested. "We have no choice," Svim interrupted. "We have no time. It has to be now." After a moment of indecision, Daimen reached to his side and threw the Imperial Orb at the crack. Zack, Daimen, Zorian and Svim quickly started casting layers upon layers of spells on it, trying to integrate it into Panicseth's prison like they had intended. It wasn't going well enough, so Zorian reached for more of the items he prepared for this: a collection of metal tablets, several staves made out of alchemically treated wood, and a box of several hundred marbles, each of which contained a three-dimensional spell formula made out of metal wire. He sacrificed it all in succession and even burned some of his life force to make his spells hit harder. He was fairly sure he noticed Zack, Svim and Daimen doing the same, burning their life to make sure the fusion worked. They succeeded. The Imperial Orb pulsed 3 times with translucent waves of rainbow light before pulling the pitch-black rift into itself. The crack in the sky disappeared, but the orb seemed to pull in the space around it still. The air warped and rippled, forming a pitch-black sphere above the orb, its surface rippling like water. Around it, a smoky gray torus burst into existence, crackling with multicolored energies. Then another, and then another, until 3 gray tori revolved around the pitch-black sphere that had suddenly grown perfectly still and featureless. The exit. It was ready. Unfortunately, that's when the glowing form of the guardian of the threshold finished materializing. It did not speak a word, simply raising its hand at the group and releasing a thick, blinding beam of white energy at them. The beam did not even cross half of the distance towards them before it suddenly split into more than 100 thinner, but equally bright beams. Zack and Zorian's simulacrums, previously held in reserve, sprang into action. So did the combat golems Zorian made for the occasion. But the beams were fast and each one swerved and pivoted in the air like a living thing, tracking its chosen target. Hastily erected defenses did nothing to stop them, and Zorian was pained to see Ilsa, Nora, and 2 of the Arania killed on the spot when the beams hit them. The exit was right there, open and ready, yet 4 people had died so close to their salvation. Some people fired a counterattack at the spectral form of the Guardian, but the entity did not attempt to dodge or shield itself from the attacks in any way. Every attack that reached it simply sank into its glowing form and disappeared. There was no indication that the Guardian had suffered any damage from the attacks, or even that it had noticed them. Damn it, they needed to start the evacuation now. Zorian started directing his simulacrums to start the preparations, but that's when the primordial chrysalis from before suddenly exploded, a large, vaguely humanoid beast bursting out of it. It had 4 arms. A 3-eyed, skeletal head stood attached to its shoulders through a long, flexible neck. Its tail was extremely long and thin, and ended with a hand-like appendage. Glossy, chitinous carapace covered it, studded with thin, razor-like spikes. It roared horribly, its sound incredibly loud and grating, and then it dropped on all 6 of its main limbs and charged straight at the center of the platform, where Zorian and the others were located. Anyone who tried to get in its way was flung aside like a rag doll, and every spell that hit it was resisted with little to show for it. The glowing form of the Guardian raised its hand again, another beam sparkling on its fingers. And then, to add a final insult to it all, the entire area rocked and shook as a series of loud booms erupted from somewhere above. Zorian's heart sank. There was no mistaking it. Someone was attacking their ritual grounds from the outside. Probably Catastrophic and the cultists. Damn it. How did they know? No, that was a silly thing to ask. He had to focus on the now. He had to. The Guardian fired another white beam of death. It once again flowered into hundreds of smaller beams, and this time they were not capable of minimizing the effects. Zorian joined his simulacrums in blocking as many as he could, but it was not enough. He watched, horrified, as Kale tried to shield his little daughter from one of the beams with his body. The beam drilled straight through them, killing them both on the spot. Kirin managed to block the beam, but that made him too distracted to deal with the primordial beast running up to him from behind. Its massive, clawed hand swiped across him, shattering through his hastily erected shield and cleaving him in half before continuing its relentless advance. Another series of explosions sounded from just outside the ritual grounds, and the spell formula that stabilized the exit to the time loop flickered dangerously. A small, almost imperceptible crack appeared on the Imperial orb floating just beneath the exit. It could no longer handle the strain of maintaining the bridge to the real world. Somewhere on the edge of the platform, Zorian could feel Taven's soul suddenly wink out. She probably bled to death while everyone was too busy fighting for their life to tend to her wounds. Suddenly, it dawned to Zorian that they were all going to die here. They were so close, they had practically won, and yet. Truthfully, I think I'd always known it would end this way, Daimen suddenly said with a small sigh. He took a knife out of his pocket and ruthlessly slashed at his wrists. Daimen! What are you doing? Zorian screeched at him. You have to live, Daimen told him, his hands trembling as he went through a complicated series of gestures with them, his wrists heavily dripping blood. It's fine if I die, but you have to live. Don't let it all be in vain. It can't. Suddenly, he thrust his bloody hands towards the collapsing exit in the air, pouring every shred of his life force into the stabilization wards. The cracks on the Imperial orb stopped spreading, the black surface of the exit calmed down into its smooth, peaceful state, and the spell formula lining the walls stopped fluctuating for the moment. Spim watched the scene for a moment before focusing on Zorian. Go, he said. Zack and I will keep the exit stable while you pass through. Zack doesn't need this, but you, Zorian protested. Go. Spim shouted at him. Zack cannot keep this stable by himself. Go now. He could do that, yes. He could go through by himself, abandoning everyone to their fate. But that. He glanced at the others, desperately fighting to keep the primordial beast away from them and keeping the Guardian of the Threshold busy with other targets. They knew the exit was there. They could have just dropped everything and made a mad dash at the exit in hopes that some of them would make it. Wouldn't that be the smartest choice, individually? Yet none of them had made that choice. Steeling his heart, Zorian stopped focusing on the maintenance of the exit, handing over his part of the burden to Svim and Zack, who visibly struggled under the increased strain. He then crouched and jumped, casting a quick flight spell and rushing straight at the exit. The primordial beast screeched in anger, increasing its pace. The Guardian suddenly teleported in front of Zorian, blocking his path and forcing him to evade and block another series of white beams that chased after him, pivoting in the air and curving their trajectories to keep him in their sights. Some of the other loopers helped him out, ignoring their own safety to block some of the beams with their own spells. The ceiling shook again, this time more severely than before, but Damon's final sacrifice had allowed things to keep working for now. He was only inches from the exit when the primordial beast suddenly opened its massive bestial mouth and fired some kind of serrated bony spike straight at his chest. He was practically a spent force by this point, and could do nothing to stop the spike from slamming straight into his back and passing straight through his chest. An explosion of blood and viscera erupted out of him, his whole chest a ruined mess. Perhaps it was just him losing all sensation as death took him, but it felt to him that everything suddenly went quiet for a moment as his flight spell failed and his body began to fall to the ground, trailing blood behind it. His wound was too serious. He was dead for sure. Closing his eyes, he initiated the final contingency, separating his soul from his body. A complicated soul spell he had always kept running in the background suddenly activated, allowing him to maintain consciousness in soul form. Without hesitation, he abandoned his dying form and rushed straight into the exit in front of him. Before either the primordial beast or the guardian of the threshold could stop him, he was already through, following invisible paths that would lead him to the real world. As a soul, his ability to perceive the real world was highly limited. He followed invisible lines of space and time, racing through a tunnel he could dimly perceive in front of him. Most of his ability to navigate in this place came from the fact he had absorbed the dimensional perception of the tunneler toad and gained a considerable amount of proficiency with it in the 5 months he had spent in the Imperial Orb. Yet, that same ability was also threatening to undo everything he had accomplished. He had bound that ability to his mana reserves in his body, but his body was no more. One of the very pillars that were supposed to anchor the ability to him was gone, and his mana reserve shuddered and churned, threatening to destabilize. Should that happen, he would lose all ability to cast spells or even direct his mana. Everything would still fail in the end. He had to hold on for a little while longer. He focused tightly on keeping control over his mana reserves, even as he tried to navigate to the exit in the real world. Dimly, he felt the tunnel start to collapse behind him. Apparently Svim and Zack had finally lost their struggle to keep the passage open. Nobody except Zorian had gone through, as far as he could tell. He drove himself to travel faster. Finally he was out. He could feel the space open up around him, the tunnel ending. For a while he was disoriented, confused about what he had to do. His mind was fuzzy. He had never spent this much time in soul form, especially not with destabilizing mana reserves. However, he eventually remembered what he had to do. He had to track down his old body. Fortunately, that was not so difficult. He had no idea where the exit had deposited him, exactly, but he and his original body shared a certain bond with each other. It was hard to cast much as a pure soul, but Zorian could do enough to craft himself a set of ghostly hands. From that point, everything became easy. A couple of divinations to lock down on the location of his old self, a couple of quick teleports to enter his room, and he was there. His old self was sleeping, blissfully unaware of the invasion. Soul Zorian did not hesitate. His soul form plunged straight into his old self's chest, causing the boy to gasp before all his body locked up as the two souls started to fight for the ownership of the body. Maybe it was quick. Maybe it was slow. Zorian had never fought a soul battle or possessed someone's body before. What he did know was that his old self never had a chance. From the moment he attacked, the ultimate outcome was never in question. He opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling of his room. His room. Yes. Definitely his room. He rose into a sitting position and looked around. It was night. He thought he would maybe wake up when Curiel came to jump on top of him, but then he remembered that the time loop technically began much earlier than that. He placed his right palm in front of him. A ghostly orb of white light bobbed up and down just above it. The soul of his old self. He stared at it for a full 5 minutes, trying to decide what to do with it. He had considered the issue before, of course, but now that he was actually here. After a while, he closed his palm around the soul, causing it to fade away and move on to the afterlife. To do anything else seemed cruel. Then he jumped out of bed, took a look around his dark, silent room and cracked his knuckles. It was time to get to work. In the months leading up to their disastrous exit from the time loop, Zorian and the other members of the group had entertained many different outcomes and how each of them would reflect on what they would have to do immediately after crossing over into the real world. This included the possibility of having to cross over in soul form, much like Zorian had ended up doing in the end. Theoretically, This meant that Zorian already knew what to do and how to arrange his priorities. In practice, things weren't so simple. While he had succeeded in leaving the time loop and possessing his old body, the process had a critical flaw. Their theorizing had assumed that, if Zorian executed everything correctly, he would be at his top form upon seizing his body. After all, he would possess a body that was flawlessly matched to his soul, so there shouldn't be any rejection issues that usually plagued possession attempts. Having crossed over as a soul meant losing all the physical resources and information storage they had planned to bring, but at least his magic would be fully intact. In reality, he didn't even have that. The problem was the dimensional ability of the tunneler toad he had anchored to himself in the time loop. His body may have been perfectly matched to his soul, but it wasn't the body to which he had anchored the ability to. Without the life force portion of the anchor, the part located in his mana reserves couldn't persist for long either. He was fortunate he had managed to prevent its collapse before successfully possessing his old body, or else he'd be dead right now and all the sacrifices the others had made would have been for nothing. However, once he established full control of his body, the ability anchor in his mana reserves finally gave out and unraveled completely. Unraveling a permanent enhancement like that was not a small matter. It caused him no pain, and he would not be permanently crippled by any means, but his mana reserves would be in utter turmoil for the next 4 to 5 days. An eternity, considering time was of the essence. Standing completely still in the darkness of his room, Zorian closed his eyes and sensed his mana again with a more critical eye. It was bad but not unmanageable. A regular mage would have been completely crippled by the chaotic, unruly nature of his current mana reserves, but Zorian had honed his shaping skills to virtual perfection. Plus, he had experienced something similar before, when Quadakikl had inflicted grievous soul damage, so he had experience in how to handle these sorts of things. Slowly and carefully, he waved his hands in the air in front of him, softly muttering a spell chant. After some time, a single flawless simulacrum materialized in front of him. The simulacrum did not speak or wait for Zorian to give him a command. He knew what was asked from it. He simply walked back to the bed, lied down, closed his eyes, and focused completely on calming down the raging mana reserves they both shared. Zorian breathed a sigh of relief as he felt his mana reserves immediately stabilize into a more manageable form. Good. So long as one of his simulacrums focused all their attention on stabilizing them, his mana reserves would remain usable. It wasn't the same as him being in top form, but it would do for now. His spellcasting restored to a usable condition, he immediately threw himself into the next task before him, confirming that Zack had left the time loop and waking him up before Red Robe had a chance to assassinate him in his sleep. A critical task that would normally require him to drop everything else and rush to Scioria, but which might be achievable through faster and cheaper methods. Quickly rummaging through his old school supplies for alchemical reagents and deconstructing a bunch of old items scattered around his room for necessary materials, Zorian constructed a simple ritual circle on the floor of his room. He then spent almost a minute performing a special long-range ritual spell, one that tapped into his marker. The same marker that he had shared with Zack. There was no guarantee that Zack still had the marker on his soul, of course, even if he had successfully left the time loop. Unlike Zorian, Zack was supposed to leave the time loop the normal way for a controller. That is to say, the guardian of the threshold would perform the transfer. For all Zorian knew, this process may have involved erasing the marker, since it was no longer necessary. However, Zorian had a suspicion that the marker was definitely going to stay embedded in Zack's soul. A suspicion that turned out to be correct, and the ritual finished, and the information from it rushed into Zorian's mind. He could feel the existence of the second marker in the direction of Scioria, shining like a star in the darkness. He breathed a sigh of relief. He had made it out. There was no reason why he wouldn't have, but so many things had gone wrong that Zorian did not dare take anything for granted. He then reached out to Zack over the faint connection provided by the ritual and their identical markers. His mana reserves dropped like a stone. Bridging the vast distances between Siren and Scioria was hard and costly, even for such a small thing. Without the two identical markers connecting them, it would have been entirely impossible. Just before he was about to run out of mana, he succeeded in touching Zack's soul. It was just a light brush, but it was enough. A sharp spiritual jolt shook his soul, shocking him awake. After observing things for a second to make sure he had really succeeded, Zorian broke the connection and stood up. He couldn't actually talk to Zack through a spell like that, so there was no point in burning through his mana to keep the link going. They would talk more once they actually met. He waited for a while till his mana reserves recovered and then cast the simulacrum spell 3 more times. Like the first simulacrums, these ones did not bother speaking either. There was no point. Zorian's connection with his simulacrum was very strong, intertwining them on both mental and spiritual levels. Though they still had their own individual minds, they were constantly exchanging thoughts with Zorian and each other, much of it on a purely unconscious level with no need to expend effort or concentration to make it happen. For simulacrums. This was the most he could manage at the moment while still remaining effective. He would be casting a lot of magic in the near future, so he had to keep his mana regeneration rate at acceptable levels. He considered what to do next for a moment, mentally bouncing ideas back and forth between his simulacrums. While they talked, they silently wandered around the house and rummaged through his belongings, gathering materials. They didn't have too much time to spend on making equipment, but some basic spell aids and disguises were a must. The chance that Red Robe and Silver Lake would target his family immediately after exiting the time loop was low, in his opinion. Those two had more pressing issues to tackle for now, and Siren was far from Scioria. Red Robe might not even know about Zorian and where he lived, or else he would have knocked Zorian out of the loop before leaving it. Silver Lake obviously did know, but she and Red Robe presumably did not know each other before now and would struggle to establish trust. Nonetheless, Zorian knew he couldn't just leave his family undefended. He had to either move them to a secure place or leave a simulacrum behind to protect them. Gathering them up and moving them to some distant area was the safest option. The most responsible option. However, that would be a lengthy and mana-expensive task, and many critical tasks would have to be postponed until it was done. He couldn't make that choice. Svim Alanik all the temporary loopers that had died to keep the exit open instead of trying to save their own lives. They had made that choice because they trusted him to look after everyone's interests once outside. He couldn't just blow everything off in order to make sure his family was perfectly protected. Plus, he was ultimately a bit selfish. Evacuating the house would require him to inform his parents about what was happening or use mental compulsions on them. He didn't want to do either. He wanted some semblance of normalcy to remain between them for now. If possible, he wanted to just wait for them to leave for Koth as they normally did. In just a few days, his parents would be on a ship at sea and all but unreachable. The problem of their safety was ultimately self-solving. It was unreasonable, perhaps, but he still held on to a tiny sliver of hope that all this could be solved without informing the whole world. He shook his head, forcibly banishing his idle thoughts and fears for the future. It wasn't the time. Just as it wasn't the time to be shaken by the death of people that had been working with him on this project for more than a year. He'd worry about that later. A little while later, all the preparations were finished and he was back in his room. He glanced at the simulacrum to his left and his copy silently nodded at him before wandering off to secure the house. Siren was not a magically potent area, and the materials he had at his disposal left a lot to be desired, but it should be enough. He would have to appropriate a fair portion of the family silverware, though. For a second, Zorian stared at the 2 remaining simulacrums in front of him. For simulacrums, but he could really only use 2 of them. So inefficient. Still, one had to work with what they had, not what they wished they had. He silently told the 2 to get ready, and then all 3 of them started to cast a powerful teleportation spell. Moments afterward, they were enveloped by a ripple in space and disappeared. Lying on the bed, the first simulacrum did not even twitch at their departure. He was wholly consumed in his task, knowing that if his attention lapsed even slightly over the next couple of hours, it could spell disaster for everything they were trying to accomplish. Having their mana reserves suddenly turn chaotic in the middle of a critical moment could kill the original or dispel one of his fellow simulacrums before they could accomplish their goals. Fortunately, Zorian's research into mental enhancements had taught him how to assume some very useful states of mind, or else he likely wouldn't have been able to maintain focus over such long periods of time. The final iteration of the month had not started auspiciously, but Zorian and his simulacrums were determined to make it work anyway. Scioria was fairly easy to teleport to, since there was a teleport beacon placed in the middle of the city. Though the real purpose of the construction was to redirect all incoming teleportation into one specific area, so that they could be more easily monitored and policed, it also acted as a sort of lighthouse for teleportation magic. This meant that while Red Robe and Silver Lake would find it very inconvenient and mana expensive to travel to a small rural town like Siren, it was relatively easy and cheap for Zorian to teleport himself towards Scioria. The moment he and his two simulacrums had arrived into the city, they each split off to pursue their own tasks. For simulacrum number 3, that meant checking up on Veyers. After all, there was a good chance that Red Robe was actually Veyers, in which case he would probably try to get his old self out of the line of fire as soon as possible. Probably. Whatever the case, visiting Jornak's place to see what was happening there was of very high importance in Zorian's mind. As he approached Jornak's house, the simulacrum grew more cautious. He slowed his pace, circling the house wearily. He knew how to bypass the house wards, of course. He'd done it dozens of times, by now. However, if Red Robe was really here, he had likely modified or upgraded those just in case. It's what Zorian himself would have done, and there was no reason to assume Red Robe had been any less cautious. His paranoia soon proved itself well warranted. As he studied the house wards, he noticed they had been subtly changed. He was lucky, or maybe unlucky, because this was pretty damning proof of Red Robe's activity. 5 minutes later, the simulacrum managed to get past the defenses and entered the house. What greeted him was eerie silence. The house was dark and abandoned, and it only took a few moments for the simulacrum to realize that both Veyers and Jornak were gone. Walking around the place, the simulacrum could see numerous signs of frantic activity scattered around the place: closets and cabinets flung open, drawers ripped out of their sockets, piles of clothes and small items scattered all over the floor. It wasn't just that Veyers and Jornak were gone, they had gathered up anything of real worth from the house before leaving. This was an evacuation, not a kidnapping. The simulacrum cast a number of divination spells, trying to see if he could get some clues about where the two had gone, but failed to find anything. That was to be expected, though it would have been shockingly incompetent of Red Robe to leave a trail behind him as he evacuated the place. The simulacrum stood in the living room of the abandoned house, fiddling with a small white statuette of a dragon that he found on the floor, lost in thought for a while. Did this prove that Veyers was Red Robe? Well, not exactly, but it did prove that he was connected to him somehow. Jornak was also gone, which could mean a lot of things. Maybe the lawyer was the real Red Robe. Admittedly, the Red Robe that Zorian met in the past was roughly his own height and thus a poor match for Jornak, who was a fully grown man, but that could be accomplished easily through shape-shifting. Or maybe the time-looping Veyers just appreciated what the older man had done for his old self and so had taken him to safety as well. Whatever the case, they were all gone now, and there was little point in staying here when there were so many other things to be done. He thought about torching the whole place out of spite, but it was better not to escalate things for now. Red Robe clearly cared a lot for these two, so burning down Jornak's place might genuinely anger him. Sure, they were already irreconcilable enemies, but doing this would make things personal. He might go after Zorian's friends and family sooner than he otherwise would have. Before he moved on, the simulacrum quickly contacted the original and the other copy to find out what was happening on their end. They were both currently fighting and couldn't talk much. Should he go help them? No, the whole point of creating so many simulacrums was to pursue many different goals simultaneously. He would just have to trust. The other two would be able to complete their task on their own. Instead he went north, towards Nyazov Dveri. It was time to see what Silver Lake was up to. While simulacrum number 3 was checking out Jornak's house, number 4 had rushed into the tunnels beneath Scioria to contact the Arania living beneath the city. Once, the Sciorian web had been his closest allies. They had taught him how to control his telepathic abilities, helped him make sense of the invasion, and provided a semblance of companionship in a world where most things were painfully short-lived. Spear of Resolve, the Iranian Matriarch, had intended to betray him in the end, but he was still devastated when they were all erased out of the time loop. Part of his desire to see them as soon as possible was definitely emotional. Everything he knew about the time loop suggested they would be alive and well out here in the real world, but he had to see that with his own eyes. In his mind, he couldn't help but draw parallels between the Arania and the temporary loopers that had sacrificed themselves so that he could cross over into the real world. He needed some good news right now. However, there was also a practical side to his visit. Zack and Zorian were quite capable of dismantling the entire invasion in a matter of days, halting it in its tracks, but that was without Red Robe's interference. Plus, who could forget Silver Lake was also working against them. Thus, the idea of just quickly shutting down the invasion was untenable. However, this did not mean they would just sit back and do nothing about them. If they wanted to do serious damage to the invaders, the best time to do so was right now, at the very beginning of the month, before Red Robe and Silver Lake had a chance to warn all their allies about the danger. They had to move quickly, and that meant recruiting helpers, and the Sciorian Arania were one of the few powerful groups that Zorian felt they could win over to their side very quickly. Apparently Red Robe agreed with his assessment, because when Simulacrum number 4 arrived on the outskirts of the Iranian settlement he found them locked in a desperate battle against Red Robe. The battle had clearly been raging for quite some time. Mutilated Iranian bodies and arachnoid viscera lay scattered everywhere, and several of the caves and tunnels had been collapsed by both sides in an attempt to get rid of the other. A choking cloud of dust lingered in the air, reducing visibility. Red Robe was just as Zorian remembered him. A bright red robe covered him completely, hiding most of his features, and a patch of magical darkness obscured his face. His movements were unhurried and methodical, though instead of painlessly and instantly killing the Arania in front of him he mostly relied on various force spells to crush them and cut them apart. The sight of him fearlessly advancing forward like an invincible juggernaut and killing Arania in very brutal and bloody ways was probably very intimidating to the spiders. Zorian suspected Red Robe was trying to crush their will to fight and scatter them before he ran out of mana. Simulacrum number 4 quickly realized that Red Robe in front of him was a simulacrum, just like him. It made sense, really. Much like Zorian had created a bunch of copies to perform several tasks simultaneously, Red Robe had likely done the same. He immediately rushed into the battle, firing a powerful incineration ray at Red Robe's back. The other simulacrum did not show any signs of surprise, as if he had fully expected the interruption. He simply turned to the side in a smooth, practiced motion, blocking both Zorian's spell and one from a nearby Arania. Simulacrum number 4 did not speak, and neither did his opponent. They simply circled each other and kept launching probing spells at one another, testing each other's skills and spell selection. The simulacrum was a bit disappointed at Red Robe's silence. Based on his previous experiences with the third time looper, he had expected Red Robe to try and strike up a conversation or start monologuing. That could have given Zorian an opportunity to figure something out about his opponent and his goals. Probably why he was staying silent. Oh well. The Arania did not interfere in their fight much. Some of the angrier ones, who had lost friends and family members to the assault, kept trying to launch surprise attacks at Red Robe whenever they spotted an opening. Many of those ended up dying, since their attacks exposed them to Red Robe's retaliation. Zorian tried to keep Red Robe too occupied to focus on the Arania much, but there was only so much he could do. Thankfully, most of the Arania had had the common sense to pull back deeper into their settlement to regroup and recover their strength. After a while of this sort of spell exchange, Red Robe suddenly stopped. He appeared indecisive for a moment, as if he wanted to say something, but he eventually just shook his head minutely and reached for a short spell rod on his belt. Zorian tensed and prepared for the fight to escalate, but it turned out he had misjudged the situation. The rod was a simple recall spell. The moment Red Robe touched it, his body blurred for a second and then he was gone. Zorian's simulacrum did not try to pursue. He was here to save the Arania and recruit them as allies, not to take out a disposable pawn that Red Robe could recreate in a couple of minutes. This was already a victory. He relaxed and waited for the Arania to approach him, reasoning that trying to be proactive wouldn't be a good idea at the moment. He may have saved them, but the Arania were still obviously tense and might lash out if they felt pressured. Thankfully, he did not have to wait long. It took less than 2 minutes for the Arania to assemble a welcoming party that cautiously approached him. They were visibly surprised when he responded to their greetings with telepathy and fumbled in indecision when he asked to talk to Spear of Resolve. The Matriarch was true to her name, however. She quickly interrupted the talks and announced she would be arriving to talk to him personally, brushing aside the outraged protests of her subordinates. Soon he was standing in front of her again, the 2 guards she brought along standing behind her and giving him their best menacing looks. To most people, she would doubtlessly look like any other Arania, a giant black jumping spider, same as any other. For the simulacrum, though, the sight brought back a flood of memories rushing to his mind. He wanted to punch her right in that big-eyed, manipulative face but also hug her and tell her he was glad to see her. This was probably similar to how Zack had felt upon seeing him on Scioria's train station, so long ago. Except that he had much better impulse control than Zack and wasn't going to punch her. Or hug her, for that matter. "Greetings, friend," Spear of Resolve said politely. "I am grateful for the help you provided us in our hour of need. We are not ungrateful people and will surely find something to reward you with, but I sense there is more to this visit than just this." "True," the simulacrum sent back. "We have many things to talk about." The Matriarch tapped her front legs against the ground curiously. "Curious. There was a curious note of nostalgia bleeding over into your messages," she pointed out. "Ah. Sorry about that," he said, wincing slightly. "I can't help it. You don't remember this, but we knew each other." "Oh. I find that very hard to believe," the Matriarch said. "It's true," the copy insisted. "We worked quite closely in the past. I have a very good memory when it comes to people, and you seem like a very noteworthy person. I would surely remember if I'd had the fortune to meet a mage of your caliber," she said. "In particular, the level of control you have over your gift would immediately make you stand out in the sea of people I have met over the years." An entirely reasonable argument. Sadly, the simulacrum didn't have time to take things slowly and delicately guide the Matriarch to the correct conclusion. He decided to take a risk and be totally blunt. "I come from the future," he told her. "That's quite a claim you're making, friend," the Matriarch said. She seemed more intrigued than dismissive, which surprised Zorian a little. He supposed that, even if she did not take his claims seriously, she wanted to hear his clarification. "Zorian Kaczynski," said the simulacrum, taking off his mask as a show of trust. If this worked, he would be working closely with these people anyway. "You can just call me Zorian." "Zorian, then," the Matriarch agreed. "Zorian, you surely realize that great claims like that require great proof to be taken seriously." Zorian no longer had the Matriarch's memory packets, which meant that the method he used to employ to get her cooperation in the past was no longer possible. However, that was okay. He had other means of catching her attention. "Of course I do," the simulacrum said. "I can even show you my memories of the timeline I came from." "Come now, Zorian," the Matriarch scolded. Any memory you show me could be fabricated entirely. That proves nothing. Not quite, the copy responded, a small grin on his face. If I showed you some random scene with little relation to you, then yes, it could easily be a forgery. But what if I showed you a detailed map of your inner settlement, including the insides of your secret research room and your treasury? What if I demonstrated detailed knowledge about your secret research and your trading networks, the sort of things only your most respected elders have access to? What if I told you the names of every arania that makes up your web, described what the insides of your private rooms look like, and demonstrated I could mimic the speech patterns and personality traits of a great many of your subordinates? Such things do not necessarily prove I come from the future, but certainly prove something, no? How could I possibly know that? The matriarch's legs began to twitch uncontrollably. A small commotion broke out among the arania surrounding them. The simulacrum could tell there was a heated discussion going on in the background. Enough, Spear of Resolve suddenly said, speaking up verbally for the first time since the meeting began. Obviously she wanted the simulacrum to hear this too. But Honored Matriarch, one of the guards protested. I've decided, she said firmly, spinning around in place to stare down the guard, who shrank back at her admonishment. She then turned back towards the simulacrum. I'll open my mind to you, the matriarch said telepathically. Show me these memories of yours. Zorian's copy did just that. He tapped into the stored memories inside his head, reproducing them as best as he was able. For several hours the arania watched in uncomfortable silence as the simulacrum laid their closely guarded secrets bare to them. He showed them his conversations with Spear of Resolve, Novelty, and the various guards and ambassadors he had interacted with in the past. By the time he was finally done, the matriarch was clearly disturbed at the amount of information he possessed. It was as the simulacrum had said, it wasn't ironclad proof that he was from the future, but it did mean he had access to just about everything about them at some point. That was disturbing enough on its own. How could you possibly know all of this? The matriarch asked hesitantly. She usually tried to project an air of certainty and confidence when interacting with him, even when she was secretly bothered behind the facade. There was none of that now, however. Even if you're from the future, even if we work together in this future, I would never. You died, Zorian's copy told her bluntly, cutting her off. You all died. That cloaked man that just attacked you earlier. In the future I know I was not strong enough. Oh, the matriarch said, deflating. You were supposedly allied with us, but you searched our city for anything of value the moment we died, one of the Arania elder interjected, accusation clear in her voice. You would have done the same in my place, he said, wholly unrepentant. The Arania said nothing to that. I am curious, the matriarch eventually said, picking her words carefully. If I were to just tell you to go away and refuse to have anything to do with you, what would you do, O mighty time traveler? I would respect your decision, the simulacrum shrugged. Truly, the matriarch asked, sounding very skeptical. Why not? I would just go to one of the other Iranian webs in the area, Zorian's copy said. It's not like you're the only Iranian web that I worked with. Every Arania in the room suddenly became very quiet and still. And simulacrum number 4 could not help but smile smugly, for he knew he had them. While the two simulacrums pursued their own tasks elsewhere in the city, the original had what was arguably the most important task of all. He had to check up on Zack and help him if he was in danger. He wouldn't put it past Red Robe and Silver Lake to focus on killing him as their very first priority. It's what Zorian would have done in their place, after all. His fears turned out to have been only half right. When he arrived at the Novita estate, he found the place on fire and racked with explosions. Destructive beams punched straight through the thick, warded walls of the building, triggering various alarms and countermeasures. Clearly an attack on Zack was already in progress. It was good that he had woken up his fellow time traveler with that ritual, or else Zack would have probably met a quick and ignoble end at the hand of his attackers. Well, attacker, singular. When he reached the site of the battle itself, he only found Red Robe fighting Zack. Silver Lake was nowhere to be seen. Very curious. Even if she was wary of Red Robe, she should have at least cooperated with him on this. In any case, this Red Robe was the same as the one that had attacked the Urania in the tunnels below. It was just a simulacrum. Once Zorian joined the fight, this second simulacrum seemed to realize the attack had failed and that persisting would just waste mana, so it just dismissed itself. What an underwhelming outcome. What was Red Robe doing, if he was so wary of really committing himself anywhere? He didn't like this. He really didn't like this. He turned towards Zack and winced. He hadn't noticed it while he had been fighting Red Robe's simulacrum, but the other boy had a large bleeding gash across the chest. Hey, Zack panted. Thanks for the wake-up call back there. If you had been just a moment late, I would have probably never woken up. His knees gave out suddenly, causing him to tip over. Zorian quickly rushed forward and caught him just before he was going to slam headfirst into the floor. Shit, Zorian swore, inspecting the wound. His medical magic was a joke, but he could at least assess the severity of an open wound like this one. You lost so much blood there. How were you even standing for so long? It's not the first time, Zack gasped, pressing his trembling fingers over the wound. The bleeding immediately lessened somewhat. I'll live. Zorian sighed. He would live, sure, but he would be pretty much incapacitated for the next day or two, even with the best medical care in the country. This was terrible news. I'm glad you made it out, Zack said with a trembling voice. Don't speak, Zorian told him telepathically, picking him up like a baby. Well, he tried to, at least. Picking up another person was a little bit too much for him, so he first had to cast some spells to lighten the load, but he managed it in the end. He then immediately set off in the direction of the nearest hospital. You're going to aggravate your wound. Also, damn, you're heavy. I'm doing you a favor, Zack responded back. Didn't you say you wanted to work out more when we get out? Not like this, you asshole, Zorian grumbled. Wait, Zack suddenly frowned. You're wounded too. Zorian gave him an incredulous look. What? Oh. No, Zorian said. My mana is in chaos because the Tunneler Toad's dimensional perception ability unraveled when I abandoned my body back in the time loop. It was scary how perceptive Zack was sometimes. Zorian didn't even think he was showing any signs of mana instability on the outside, but clearly he was wrong. Oh yeah, Zack said, immediately calming down. Still, doesn't that mean I'll be held back in what I can do for at least a couple of days? Yes, Zorian confirmed. Damn it. Nothing ever goes right about this. Zack raged. I wouldn't say that, Zorian said. He tracked down the nearest potion store and teleported them both towards it. It was closed at this time of day, but breaking in was a simple matter. He idly wondered whether a medical emergency like this counted as a valid reason to perform a burglary, but then decided he didn't care. He would anonymously pay the shopkeeper back for the damages he caused. I'm sure Red Robe is feeling pretty aggrieved right now. He almost had you, but he failed in the end. Plus, my simulacrum just stopped him from getting rid of the Urania beneath the city. He quickly picked up the most powerful wound-closing and blood-replenishing potions in the store and fed them to Zack, who immediately showed a positive reaction. His skin got back some of its color and the wound seemingly closed, though Zorian knew it was still very much present beneath the surface. Zack immediately tried to get up on his own 2 feet, the idiot. He collapsed back immediately, having aggravated his wound. Let's just get you to the nearest hospital, all right? Zorian said, facepalming at the sight. Zorian, listen, Zack said. When you left through the exit and the time loop reset itself, I lingered behind for a bit. Just to see what would happen to you and Silver Lake over the next few restarts, you know. Zorian raised his eyebrow at him. And? You were back, Zack said. Both of you. You didn't remember anything about the time loop, but you were walking and talking as normal. You were just like any other person stuck in the time loop, unaware of the passage of time past the summer festival. Man, talking to your old self was freaky, I tell you. I all but forgot how unfriendly and sensitive you were back then. Did I tell you I'm really glad you made it out in the end? You did, Zorian confirmed. Oh yeah, what did you do with the Zack started to ask, before being cut off by Zorian. I killed him, Zorian said curtly. Sent his soul to the afterlife. I am shit, Zack fumbled. That's kind of brutal. What was I supposed to do? Zorian asked, uncomfortable with this line of questioning. I don't know how to make a new body for him. Maybe I never will. I'd have to either keep him in stasis for years and years before finally releasing him into an alien world where a stranger has usurped his life, or having him accompany me as a powerless ghost looking over my shoulder, constantly getting his face rubbed in at the fact I'm so much better than him at everything. Isn't that a cruel and horrifying fate to inflict on someone? I don't know, Zack admitted after a while. I know I'm not the same person as him by this point, Zorian said quietly, but I would hate that with every fiber of my being. I don't think I'd ever get over it. Maybe I'm just a selfish monster trying to justify my crimes, but I think I'm doing him a favor. Alanik says the afterlife is still a thing, even after the gods stopped talking to people. For all his faults, I don't think the old Zorian had done anything truly heinous in his life. There should be a good outcome waiting for him there. Something he'd never get back here with us. There was an awkward silence for a few seconds, and then Zorian cracked his knuckles before picking Zack up again. Thank the gods for lightning spells. I don't want to talk about this, Zorian admitted. Let's just get you to a hospital and call it a day. We'll just have to leave the rest to our simulacrums. Now that I think about it, maybe Red Robe is onto something by only sending simulacrums to tackle problems and never appearing in person. Sure, it makes him more likely to fail and get beaten back, but it also makes every failure more inconsequential. He babbled about all sorts of things as he walked through the city. He was mostly out of mana by this point, since pretty much all his simulacrums had been tapping into them for their own purposes, so he couldn't simply teleport to the hospital. However, it was fine. Zack had stopped bleeding by this point, so he wasn't going to die anytime soon. He should make use of this breather to make some golem simulacrums and replace the current ectoplasmic ones with them. Of course, the golem simulacrums were expensive, so he would have to raid some of the Abasin caches for money and materials. Plus, he needed a proper workshop and... He suddenly stopped and sighed internally. So many things to do. So little time and mana to play with. The only thing that made him feel better was that Red Robe and Silver Lake were probably faced with choices just as difficult as theirs. Hopefully they had chosen their priorities better than their opponents. When simulacrum number 3 arrived at the spot of Silver Lake's hideout, he found no signs of fighting or forced entry in the vicinity. However, that did not actually tell him much. For all he knew, Silver Lake had some kind of secret entrance into her pocket dimension, and could simply walk in any time she pleased, wards be damned. Hell, perhaps the old Silver Lake had simply let her in. It was hardly a given that the two would fight to the death once they met. It all depended on whether the time looper Silver Lake wanted to kill her old self to take her life and belongings back, or if she wanted to recruit her into her plans. Or maybe she intended to simply ignore her old self entirely. After all, simply coming here was highly dangerous, since Zack and Zorian knew about this place, and it was an obvious place to set up an ambush for her. Anyway, the first task Simulacrum 3 currently faced was checking if the old Silver Lake was still alive and inside. If she was, then he needed to know if the time looper Silver Lake had already visited her and tried to recruit her. To find that out, he could rely on slowly using exotic divination on her hideout while carefully avoiding being found out, but that would take a lot of time and mana and he didn't want to bother. Instead he simply made an unearthly racket just out of her pocket dimension, screaming obscenities at the treacherous old witch until she decided to come out to confront him. Which she did. She stomped out of the pocket dimension, visibly fuming and glaring at him. The simulacrum immediately decided she probably hadn't been visited by her time looper self. She had approached him too carelessly, like she had no idea what he was capable of. She would have been far more cautious if the other Silverlake had warned her about him. Still, he had to make sure. "Boy, what the hell are you shouting for?" Silverlake shouted, stopping some distance away from him. "Coming here in the dead of the night, at 3 in the morning, shouting all these obscenities at a poor old woman like me. What is the world coming to these days? Haven't your parents taught you to respect your elders? Bow down and apologize or I'm going to poison your whole family, you hear me?" "I just wanted to get your attention," the simulacrum told her honestly. That only made her angrier. "Listen, I'm kind of in a hurry. Did you perhaps get visited lately by an ugly old crone that looks just like you?" Silverlake raised her hand and fired a weak lightning bolt. Well, relatively speaking, since that spell could have inflicted serious damage to a normal person. Zorian's simulacrum, though. He simply copied his mentor Svim and backhanded the lightning bolt to the side. Rather than char his hand, the bolt was deflected harmlessly into the nearby ground, creating a small crater in the forest soil. Silverlake's posture instantly changed, becoming warier and more alert. "No, seriously, did someone who looks just like you visit you recently and try to kill you or recruit you? Someone who knows all your secrets and abilities?" he again asked. "Who are you?" Silverlake said, her eyes narrowing suspiciously and her hands twitching with half-formed spells. The simulacrum clacked his tongue. She was totally ignorant of everything, he was sure of it. Time Looper Silverlake had not visited this place. But why? Did she really not care about her old self, or was she just being paranoid? He hadn't arrived here particularly quickly. If Silverlake wanted to travel here from Scioria, she would have arrived way before he did. In all likelihood, she would have finished up before he had a chance to get here and intercept her. "Hey! Are you deaf or something?" Silverlake shouted, kicking a nearby stone in his direction. It was surprisingly accurate, flying straight at his forehead. She had a pretty good kick. Of course, Zorian just dodged the stone with practiced ease, so it ultimately amounted to nothing. He could kill her, he realized. Even if Time Looper Silverlake wanted her dead, there was no guarantee that old Silverlake would be grateful to them once they saved her. She was an incredibly cynical person, and would simply see two young fools she could exploit to her advantage. She might work with them out of a sense of self-preservation, but she would be constantly looking for an angle to exploit and probably wouldn't want to do anything that placed her into significant danger. What was the point of such an ally? "Here. Catch," he said, throwing a small stone disc at her. She did not bother catching it, simply stepping back and letting it hit the ground. She then used a nearby fallen branch to suspiciously poke at it. The simulacrum rolled his eyes at her. "What the hell is this thing?" she asked. "It's an illusion stone," the simulacrum said. "I recorded a rather interesting scene in it. You can study it later in the privacy of your own abode. Oh, and by the way, you should probably change your warding scheme as soon as possible. You should also collapse any secret entrances into your place, even if you think you're the only one who knows about them." He turned to leave. "Now wait just a moment here, you little brat. You're just going to leave without explaining any of the crap you just unloaded into my lap?" Silverlake demanded. "Yes," Zorian's copy nodded. "I decided not to kill you. Don't make me regret it, alright?" Before she could respond, he teleported away. He didn't want to linger around Silverlake's place. While setting up an ambush around her hideout might have seemed like a good way to get the time-looping version of her, Zorian felt something wasn't right there. He had to make sure Alanik, Kale and Lukav were fine. Silverlake could wait. While Zorian and the other simulacrums were teleporting around and racking their heads to figure out what the enemy was planning, simulacrum number 2 was bored. His job was to secure the house and watch out for Red Robe or Silver Lake staging an attack on his family. However, he had already done all he could to secure the house and no attack was happening. The hours passed, and eventually he found himself in front of Kiriel's room. The morning was already here, wasn't it? Didn't that mean it was about time for Kiriel to wake up? He rubbed his hands sinisterly, an evil grin on his face. It had been so long since he had a chance to wake up Kiriel. He liked to sleep in, and the time loop never really changed that, so it was usually her that woke him up. He entered her room and crouched next to her bed. She was covered up to her neck in a blanket, with only her face visible. She was blissfully unaware of Zorian crouching next to her, a look of peace and contentment on her face. The simulacrum considered how he should go about doing this. Jumping on her, like she liked to do to him, had an air of poetic justice on it. However, it didn't feel right. He was too big and heavy, and it would be a bit too much for a prank. Dropping a bucket of water on her like she had when she had thought he was a shapeshifter. No, that would get the bed wet and Mother would freak out on him. Oh well, he'd just go with the classic. "Good morning, sister," he suddenly shouted in her ear. "Morning, morning, morning." She woke up screaming and flailing, and eventually fell out of the bed. He laughed at her. Ah, he needed that. "Zorian, you jerk," she shouted at him, flailing her little arms at him like a windmill. She was like a little angry kitten, though, so it just made him laugh harder. She eventually kicked him out of the room so she could switch out of her pajamas. Once she was out, she gave him a curious look. "How come you're awake?" she asked. "I couldn't sleep," the simulacrum said. "Oh," she said. She looked at him hopefully. "Hey, can you show me some magic? Please." He watched Kiriel deflate when he told her he had to go pack and couldn't play with her anymore. She looked like she wanted to ask him something but eventually just chickened out, staring at the floor like a kicked puppy instead. He sighed internally. He knew what she wanted to ask, of course. She wanted him to take her to Scioria with him. But doing that would be irresponsible. Short-sighted. Stupid. He watched Kiriel for a few more seconds, remembering all the promises he made to his little sister over the many restarts he shared with her. He promised he wouldn't forget her. He promised he would teach her magic. He promised he would bring her with him to Scioria. Just as she was about to run off, Zorian placed his hand on her shoulder, causing her to halt in her tracks and look at him in surprise. Her lip quivered slightly. "Hey, Kiriel," he told her with a mischievous smile. "Do you want to come with me to Scioria?" Simulacrum number 2 could practically imagine Zorian screaming at him in the near future, explaining in great detail what an idiot he was being. He didn't care, though. The smile on her face when he asked her that question made it all worth it. Sometimes he could be so stupid, Zorian lamented. He had known that his simulacrums tended to be more impulsive and whimsical than himself. It seemed to be an intrinsic trait of every one of his copies, no matter how carefully he made them or how closely they were connected to him. They may be very much like him, but they weren't him. The moment they realized they were just a simulacrum that would not live past a few hours or days, their perspective on long-term consequences would get subtly skewed compared to his own. After all, more likely than not it wouldn't be them who would have to deal with those when the time finally came. He also knew that giving his simulacrums unpleasant or boring tasks had a good chance of coming back to bite him in the ass. His simulacrums did not mind dying for him, but they were not at all afraid of inconveniencing him. In fact, they often seemed to relish the idea. Zorian wondered what it said about him that his simulacrums behaved that way, but that was a thought for another time. The point was that, despite knowing all of that, he had still left his simulacrum in charge of dashing Kiriel's hopes of going to Scioria. He should have known that was going to be a problem, but he thought it would be a simple matter of the simulacrum refusing Mother's offer while Kyrielle remained quiet on the sidelines. This was, after all, what usually happened when Zorian didn't want to bring Kyrielle with him. All the simulacrum had to do was just retread his steps and be on his merry way. Instead his copy got bored and actively sought Kyrielle out to hang out with, wasting their precious mana on frivolous entertainment, and then got all emotional when it was time to say goodbye. Ugh. Just like the offending simulacrum predicted, Zorian had been furious. It was a stupid, short-sighted decision. Yes, sending her off to Koth with their parents would be a massive disappointment for her, but at least she'd be out of danger. That was more important than making her momentarily happy. The simulacrum was completely unapologetic about it, too. What's done is done, his copy told him over their telepathic link. I already gave her my word I'm taking her with me. If you have a problem with that, you can come over here and personally inform her that you've changed your mind and won't be taking her with you after all. You bastard. Zorian fumed at him. I should dismiss you for that. That would leave Kyrielle and the rest of the family completely defenseless until you send a replacement, the simulacrum pointed out. Besides, do you really think I care about that? From my very first moment, I knew my time was fleeting. Sadly, true. Since his simulacrums were willing to die and sacrifice themselves for his sake, the thought of dying did not bother them much. Thus, threatening to unmake them was largely ineffective. I just don't understand why you did that, Zorian complained. We could have just taken Kyrielle to Scioria in a month or two, once the whole situation has hopefully been resolved and she's back from Koth. There is no need to take her there now, when the situation there is at its most dangerous. When, if not now, the simulacrum disagreed. Even if we can resolve everything and save the city, the consequences are bound to be immense. Even a failed invasion will make our parents perceive Scioria as a place of unspeakable danger. You think they will let her live in the city after that? Even for a few days? Come on. This is probably the last time we can plausibly take Kyrielle to Scioria without literally kidnapping her. Zorian frowned. He hadn't really thought of that. It was true that no matter how the situation with the invasion was resolved, it was bound to complicate things. Plus, now that he thought about it a little, Kyrielle would have to go back to school at some point soon. It wasn't like she could visit a different city for several weeks at a time, then. Come to think of it, that was probably the reason why she was so excited to make this trip with him now. She knew this was one of her last chances to experience something like this in the near future. He sighed internally. For all of its blessings, he sometimes worried that the time loop had damaged his thinking. For more than a decade, anything that did not resolve itself within the span of a month was largely irrelevant. He did consider the future a lot, but that was all highly theoretical and often directed at the far future rather than something only a few months later. Still. Even with all of that in mind, bringing Kyrielle to the epicenter of their clash with Red Robe and Silver Lake was simply a terrible idea. Besides, his copy continued, by bringing Kyrielle along we actually have a legitimate excuse to rent a room at Amaya's place. Kale is much more willing to trust us if we come along with Kyrielle. And it's not like we don't have a plan to evacuate. Those are just excuses you thought up afterwards to justify your decision, Zorian told him. Well yes, the simulacrum admitted after a short pause. Yes, I admit that. It's still true, though, and I'm not going to go back on my word. Our word. You promised you're not going to just forget her once we're out there in the real world. Now you want to just stick her on a ship to Koth and put her out of your mind while you do your stuff. That stuff is a matter of life and death, and getting her out of danger doesn't mean I'm going to simply forget about her afterwards. Zorian snapped. I just want her to be safe. She's a prime target and I'm just a little bit busy at the moment. It's not the time for this. Forget it, his copy sighed. I won't do it, okay? I already said it. What's done is done. I'm not going to turn around and tell her it was all a mistake and that I changed my mind. It would kill her. If you think this is such a huge mistake, come over and do it yourself. Go tell her that her dream trip is cancelled, I dare you. The simulacrum then terminated their connection, signaling it considered the conversation over. After taking several deep breaths and calming down somewhat, Zorian decided that the simulacrum was right about one thing: he should definitely be dealing with this problem personally. As he noted in his earlier lament, it was stupid of him to assign a task like this to a simulacrum to begin with, and only he could truly fix it. Or at least stop the problem from getting worse. Besides, there was no need for him to stay in Scioria at the moment. Previously, he had been worried that his simulacrum would get dispelled in the fighting and that he would need to constantly replace them, but that was far less of a concern, now. The first golem simulacrums had been placed into service by now, replacing 2 of his ectoplasmic simulacrums with a more mana-efficient and resilient group. Golem simulacrums were very difficult to neutralize. Even punching a hole through the chest or blowing off a limb would not be enough to put them down for good. That extreme resilience, all by itself, should allow his copies to clash with the invaders and red robes simulacrums without fear. Additionally, he couldn't really afford to start anything big while Zack was still incapacitated and vulnerable. Taking some time off to figure out what to do about his family and friends was doable. Thus, not long after his argument with his simulacrum, Zorian found himself back in Siren. He told the simulacrum to make himself scarce for a while and then seamlessly took over his place. Well, mostly seamlessly. Why are you staring at me like that? Kiriel asked him suspiciously, narrowing her eyes at him. You aren't thinking on going back on your word, are you? She didn't seem panicked, more outraged at the idea. She placed her hands on her hips and pouted at him in a way that was probably supposed to look angry but looked more like she had an upset stomach or something. No take-backs, she declared, pointing her finger at him. Mom says that's not allowed. You said you're taking me with you, and I'm going. Zorian clacked his tongue in distaste. All he did was stare at her a little, and she immediately started jumping at this one specific conclusion. How judgmental. Never mind that she was essentially correct here. Was his old self so bad that this was a legitimate first conclusion she came up to? Okay, yeah, he could kind of see her reasoning here. I didn't say anything about not taking you, Zorian said slowly. Then what? She asked curiously. I'm missing some of my school books, Zorian told her. I'd appreciate it if whoever took them returned them to me before we leave the house. Yeah, I will. I'm sure they'll turn up in your room by the time I finish packing, Kiriel fumbled, punctuating her statement with a nervous laugh. She then gave him one final suspicious look before running off upstairs to finish her packing. Shut up, idiot, Zorian whispered under his breath. This is all your fault, anyway. He did not need to speak up verbally, of course, but it made him feel slightly better to do so. Why hadn't he dismissed his stupid copy, again? Oh, right. He didn't want to waste mana and he had a task for him later. In any case, nothing of real note happened until Ilsa knocked on their door, just like she always did at the start of the month, and Zorian volunteered to check up on that. Sure enough, he found Ilsa waiting for him behind the door. After an appraising glance, she adjusted her glasses and guessed his identity. Zorian Kaczynski, she asked. That's me, Zorian confirmed. Come in, Miss Salady. Oh, you know me? She asked in mild surprise, stepping into the house. Kind of, Zorian said. Someone pointed you out to me. You're a teacher from the academy, right? That's right, Ilsa said. I didn't know I'm that famous. Hopefully you heard only nice things about me, yes? She gave him a small smile, and Zorian awkwardly returned it. She didn't remember anything. That is, of course she didn't remember anything. He and Zack had already done a check of the various temporary loopers to see if any of them made it out in soul form like Zorian. The results were as expected as they were disappointing. They were all alone in this. Nobody else had made it out. It was strange and more than a little painful for Zorian to see Ilsa like this. He had worked with her for nearly a year, and she had been one of the people he had been relatively close to. Now that Ilsa was dead, the new one had no idea who he was. The same was true for Alanik, Taven, Kale, Svim, and so many others. They were alive again, but they were not people he had spent all those months working with. He could rebuild these relationships, but without the common goal of escaping the time loop and the limited ability to interact with people outside the group, the nature of those relationships would completely differ. In the meantime, he had to interact with all these people while constantly walking on eggshells because he subconsciously viewed them as friends and allies, and had a year's worth of habits and instincts to reinforce that while they just viewed him as some stupid teenage kid acting a little weird around them. He'd manage. He totally would. But damn, was this making him depressed. "Mr. Kaczynski? Are you alright?" Ilsa asked him, breaking him out of his self-pity. "I'm fine," he assured her. "Just thinking about some things. It's nothing important." He turned the scroll in his hands a few times before casually directing his mana to flow along the sides of the seal, causing it to pop off without resistance. He then glanced at the certificate inside for the sake of appearances and set it aside. "That's pretty impressive," Ilsa noted. "Although you held onto the scroll for a while, I could tell you spent most of that time distracted with other thoughts. Once you actually focused on the task of removing the seal, you did it quickly and easily. I see someone is continuing in Damon's footsteps." Once, the comparison to Die Men would see him bristling inside at the slight. Now it was just a mildly exasperating statement. He would likely never be totally okay with being compared to his oldest brother like that, but these comparisons no longer had the same sting they once did. "Only in very general terms," Zorian told her. "My brother and I are very different people." "Of course," Ilsa smoothly agreed. "Everyone is their own person. I simply meant that you also show signs of great talent." Their discussion proceeded in very predictable fashion. Once she heard he was taking Curiel with him to Scioria, she brought up the possibility of renting a room at Amaya's place, which Zorian accepted. She also informed him that he wouldn't get to choose his mentor like he was supposed to, and that he was simply assigned to Svim Chow instead. Zorian pretended he knew nothing about the man and Ilsa pretended he was simply a normal, if slightly demanding teacher. He also chose his electives. They were the exact same ones he had chosen the first time he had done all this, except this time the entire process took less than a minute, since he simply told Ilsa his choices the moment she brought the topic up. It was all so routine and familiar that he found himself quickly slipping into a sort of practiced role he had learned to play over the many restarts during which he had done this. It felt comforting and frightening at the same time. Comforting, because this was probably the first time since he had gotten out of the time loop that he felt certain he was making the right choices. Frightening, because he suddenly felt like he was in the time loop all over again. Like everything around him was unreal and illusionary. Unbidden, the notion that he was still trapped in that ever-repeating month popped into his mind and refused to go away. He imagined himself living through this month, winning against his foes, befriending people he knew from the time loop, changing things for the better and getting emotionally invested in it all only for the whole thing to turn to smoke in the end when the time loop inevitably reset itself and he woke up in his room in Siren, just like he always did. It was horrifying. It was also stupid. He was definitely out of the time loop. The Urania and the mercenaries that had been knocked out of the time loop by Red Robe were back, and Red Robe himself was again active in the world. The spirit world was also once again accessible. He and Zack had checked that already. All evidence pointed at them being out for real. But the fear remained. Ilsa had finished her explanations and left, but Zorian's mind remained trapped in this ominous scenario for quite a while afterwards. Sometimes he could be so stupid, Zorian lamented. The long train ride from Siren to Scioria was even more boring than it usually was. This was mostly because Zorian was not doing anything of critical importance, and thus had to refrain from tapping into his mana reserves too much. That mana was best reserved for his simulacrums, who were out there acquiring funds, making magic items, teleporting around, and fighting their enemies. Frivolous uses of magic like entertaining Curiel on the train with illusions were simply inexcusable. He had scolded his simulacrums over these sorts of things many times in the past, so now that he was in their position it was important that he set an example for them and show them how things should be done. Additionally, this was no longer the time loop, and he would have to deal with consequences that went beyond just this 1 month. It was best for him to at least pretend to be a normal student mage in front of a little tattletale like Curiel. That meant no spellcasting at all for the moment, since students could not bypass the wards on the train. After an hour or so, he kinda began to understand why his simulacrums were so prone to breaking that no frivolous magics rule. Still, in the end he found ways to amuse himself and Curiel without magic. He told her stories of some of his time-looping adventures, using true stories with altered names and a few tweaks here and there. Curiel complained the stories were too fantastical and ridiculous after a while, so they started a drawing competition instead. Zorian had actually learned how to draw reasonably well over the long course of the time loop, but he was nowhere near good enough to match Curiel, so she always won. His sister did not mind, though. Even though it was an unfair competition right from the start, she always wanted to keep going for another round. The little imp never got tired of winning. Now stopping in Corsa, a disembodied voice echoed. A crackling sound again. I repeat, now stopping in Corsa. Thank you. A few things happened in quick succession then. First, Eerie wandered in and peeked into the compartment to see if it was free. Zorian, being kind of bored with Curiel's antics, invited her in. Eerie seemed a little taken aback by his friendliness, but seeing Curiel put her at ease, and she did claim a seat beside them after a moment of hesitation. Then Byrne, a guy he had met way back at the beginning of his time-looping experience, also wandered in and asked if a seat was free in their compartment. Zorian happily invited him in, too. Suddenly, the compartment had become a lot livelier than it used to be. Eerie was shy and quiet, and had immediately chosen to bury her nose in a book when she came in, but Byrne was friendly and talkative and immediately tried to strike up a conversation with them. Curiel immediately started peppering him with questions about magic and the academy. I'm Curiel Kaczynski, Curiel said, and that's my brother Zorian. Are you a student like Zorian? Can you do magic? What year are you? Is it true that you have to fight a giant spider in order to get admitted as a student? Zorian says that's a requirement, but I think he's lying. Haha, I don't think I would have gotten in, if that were the case, Byrne laughed. I don't think I could win a fight against the other students, never mind a giant spider. Lots of types of giant spiders, Zorian noted. There's a whole bunch of them that you could easily club to death with a mundane weapon, so long as you keep your cool and don't panic. Oh. You sound pretty knowledgeable about that. Did you ever fight one for real? Byrne asked curiously. Yes, though not as an admission test, of course, Zorian said. I told that to Curiel just to mess with her a little. I knew it, Curiel pouted, folding her hands over her chest and giving him a grumpy look. Ah, so, I hate to shift the subject, but that last name, Byrne tried. Yes, Daimen Kaczynski is our brother, Zorian said with a shrug. We have very little contact with him, though. He mostly does his own thing and rarely visits. The conversation continued for a while after that, meandering from topic to topic. Even Eerie joined in after figuring out from Byrne's question that they were Fortov's siblings. She did not actually bring up Fortov, however, which was probably for the best. Zorian would have been diplomatic, of course, but Curiel disliked their middle brother as much as he did and would likely not have anything nice to say about that topic. In any case, the conversation eventually turned towards a particularly shocking event that occurred in Scioria recently. Namely, the fact that Zack's place had gotten utterly trashed during his fight with Red Robe, and that he himself had gone missing for several hours while people frantically searched for him all over the city. What? Someone actually attacked the Novita mansion like that? I didn't know that, Ivory said, surprised. Yes, it happened really recently. The attack happened very early in the morning, just a few hours ago, Byrne said, nodding self-indulgently. He was clearly pleased to have acquired this news so soon after it occurred. Man, news sure does spread fast these days. I hear the fighting was really fierce. Some of the support columns were damaged, and several walls got breached. I heard repairs will take weeks. It must have been a really powerful force that launched the attack. The newspapers were saying only a fully equipped mage regiment could have done so much damage so quickly. But that place is right there in one of the better parts of the city, and aren't Novita an old, influential noble house? Ivory asked. How could a force of that size come and go just like that? Where were the guards during all this? Well, someone was clearly fighting the attackers and fought them off in the end, so presumably the guards were not useless, Byrne shrugged. Besides, I hear the Novita are not the same force they once were. My father says they're a mere shadow of their former selves. It's still crazy that something like this can happen. You know, Zack Novita is one of my classmates, Zorian said suddenly. Really? Byrne said, perking up. I don't suppose you heard more about this, then? I just know Zack is fine, Zorian said, shaking his head. He wasn't present in the mansion when the attack occurred. He was out drinking and dancing throughout the entire night. Or at least that was the excuse Zack had picked for himself as an explanation as to what had happened. They modified the memory of the healer that had patched him up, after leaving him a sizable, anonymous tip for his services, so no one should be able to contradict his story. Zorian did suggest to Zack that he should pick some other excuse, since saying he had spent the entire night getting drunk and gods know what else was somewhat embarrassing, but Zack insisted this was fine. Sure enough, Ivory responded to Zorian's explanation by wrinkling her nose in distaste, while Byrne simply laughed awkwardly. I did hear rumors about the Novita heir, Ivory said. They say he's not exactly a model student, if you know what I mean. There is nothing wrong with his magic skills, Zorian quickly said, feeling compelled to defend his friend. He's just a little reckless. Are you friends with this Zack? Kiriel asked curiously. How come I don't know anything about this? Why would I say something like this to a little tattletale like you? Zorian asked rhetorically. You'd run off to tell mother the moment my back was turned. I would not, she huffed, swinging her legs in an attempt to hit his knees. He shifted his legs out of the way a few times and she eventually gave up on the idea. By the time the train arrived in Scioria, the whole group was so absorbed in their conversation that they kept together and continued conversing even when it was time to disembark. When the train began to approach Scioria, the whole group left the compartment and went to stand by the exit along with so many others. Usually Zorian led Kiriel with him to the exit early enough to seize a place right next to the exit, but he had lost track of time this time, and they ended up in the middle of a literal throng. Somewhat tired from socializing and put off by the throng of people pushing and shoving all around him, Zorian leaned on the nearby window and simply observed the people around them. It had been a while since he had been stuck in a crowd like this. With his great magical skills and ability to simply teleport from place to place, he usually had no need to use normal transportation methods to get to places. A confusing, erratic mess of emotions and mental signals washed against his mind sense, but he was far too good at controlling his psychic powers these days to be bothered by that. His mind was like a rock in the sea, battered by the winds and violent waves, but solid and unmoving. Hey, you! You're one of the upperclassmen, aren't you? Zorian looked at the girl talking to him, curious as to what she wanted from him. She was part of the group of first years next to him, and had completely ignored him up until now. Her whole group was kind of amusing, talking excitedly amongst themselves about how they were going to start learning magic, and become famous mages, and similar stuff. He kind of wished he could see their faces when they realized the first year was all about theory and repetitive mana exercises. I am, he confirmed. So. Can you show us any magic? She asked eagerly. Wait, this sounded kind of familiar. He can't. Kyriel, who had apparently been listening in on their conversation, piped in. The train has a magic field that stops people from doing magic. It's because some of the students would set fire to the seats or etch their names in crude drawings into the walls of the train, Zorian confirmed. Oh, the girl said, clearly disappointed. I know, Kyriel agreed with, sadly. It sucks. Some jerk always has to ruin it for the rest of us. Yeah, this whole situation was really familiar to him for some reason. Oh well, it probably wasn't anything important. Zorian became a little concerned about things after the group disembarked at Scioria's main train station. This was because Bryn had a habit of following after them, and Zorian had plans that would be rather inconvenienced by that. He was just debating whether it was justified to use mind magic to nudge his thoughts in the right direction, when Bryn regretfully informed them that he had to stay behind at the station for a while. Apparently his parents were disturbed enough by the recent attack on the Novita mansion that they had asked a friend of theirs that lived in the city to pick Bryn up from the station and escort him to his dorm. Thus, Bryn would have to stay behind and wait for the man to show up. Zorian found it curious that Red Robe's attack on Zack had such far-reaching consequences. Bryn wasn't even from Scioria, yet the attack changed the way he went through the month so quickly and radically. Zack and Zorian knew that Tezen and the city authorities would have a strong reaction to the Novita mansion being suddenly attacked like that, but he didn't expect the ordinary people to care so much. In any case, Zorian simply said goodbye to Bryn and Ivory and was on his merry way with Kyriel in tow. He did exchange contact methods with Bryn and Ivory in case they wanted to get in touch later, but he wasn't sure if anything would come out of that. Neither of them had been particularly inclined to seek him out when they had done similar things in the time loop. With the world lasting longer than a month, though, perhaps that would change. Only time would tell. Zorian didn't take Kyriel immediately towards Amaya's place, though. Instead, he took her to a familiar bridge in one of the city parks. There, a small black-haired girl was crying her eyes out over a bicycle that had fallen into the creek below. Kyriel watched quietly from the sidelines as Zorian slowly calmed Nachka down and got her to explain why she was crying. This done, he placed his hand over the bridge and telekinetically lifted the bike out of the water. He also casually cleaned it up a little, ignoring the chorus of complaints from his simulacrums that he was being frivolous in his mana use. The jerks had been on the lookout for something like this for a while now, most likely. It isn't frivolous, he told them telepathically. What did you expect me to do, exactly? You could have waded in through the muddy water on foot, a simulacrum helpfully explained. It's just getting a little wet, there's no harm in that, another one added. All it would take is a bit more time. Gods, why are you so impatient, a third one scolded. All of you, shut up and mind your own business. Zorian told them grumpily. He had the worst simulacrums. There, Zorian told Nachka. Your bike is clean, intact, and out of the creek. You can stop crying now, okay? Okay, she sniffed, rubbing her eyes. Thank you. Well, if that's that, I guess we should get going now, Zorian said. Though I think it's going to rain soon. Do you have an umbrella? And no, she said, shaking her head. But, I'm going to be fine. We should help her get home, Kyriel suddenly said. She quickly got into Nachka's personal space and introduced herself. Hi, I'm Kyriel. Kyriel Kaczynski, and that's my brother Zorian. What's your name? After some back and forth, Nachka agreed to have them accompany her home. The walk was a short one, but Zorian paid close attention to everything around him along the way. He found no evidence of cephalic rats or other invader agents along the way. Even the cephalic rat swarm he usually encountered while traveling through this part of the city was not here this time. He had chosen the path that led to Notchka on purpose, not because he was trying to avoid the rats. The Urania were fighting a pretty intense war with the cephalic rats at the moment, so this turn of events wasn't particularly surprising. They were too busy to spy on people much, and could no longer move freely through most of the city. Still, while Ray and her family seemed free of invader schemes at the moment, he knew that wouldn't last forever. Assuming Red Robe did not find some kind of alternative method of unlocking Panicseth's prison, shifter children like Notchka remained a critical component of Primordial's release plans. Thus, evacuating them out of the city through means fair or foul was probably the most certain way of sabotaging the ritual at Zack and Zorian's disposal. Shifters were not that numerous and there were only so many shifters available in the area. Though, if he were going to be honest with himself, wanting to befriend Ray and her family wasn't purely because of pragmatism. Ray had no special influence over her fellow shifters and would be of limited help if he wanted to talk them into going along with the evacuation. He just had a soft spot for the little girl that had befriended his little sister, and the sight of her stripped naked and waiting to be drained of all blood for some messed up blood ritual was vividly burned into his mind. He had promised to himself that he would make sure Notchka survived the month out there in the real world, and he still meant that. He meant to save all the shifter children, of course, but making sure Notchka was safe had a personal dimension for him. Since he had already thrown away his good sense and taken Kiriel to the death trap that was Scioria, he may as well introduce her to her former and future friend. At least if they started hanging around each other, he could more easily protect the both of them without spreading himself thin. The actual conversation with Ray was pretty mundane. Notchka's mother was pretty friendly, and Zorian did not confront her with any heavy topics. They simply talked about who he and Kiriel were, how they had met Notchka, and where they were staying. Kiriel almost ratted out Notchka on dropping her bike in the stream, which caused the little cat shifter to panic and hurriedly shut her up by manifesting her claws and clamping down on Kiriel's arm. This caused Ray to freak out because Notchka almost ruined their secret and hurt a guest, but the situation was thankfully resolved in the end, and Zorian pretended not to have noticed anything strange about the incident. Interestingly, Ray also brought up the news of Zack's place being attacked, just like Bryn did. She didn't have any new information for Zorian, but it did emphasize how notable the attack was for people. Zorian wondered if Red Robe even realized how eye-catching the whole thing would end up being. "You are classmates with the Novita heir?" Ray asked. I seem to have met an important person today." "Not really," Zorian said dubiously. "Come now, Mr. Kaczynski. You have a famous brother, you attend a prestigious magical academy, and one of your classmates is a scion of a noble house," Ray pointed out. "Two, actually," said Zorian. "There was also Tinami. I don't think any of that makes me important." Ray hummed loudly at him, clearly not agreeing. "Have it your way," she shrugged. She rose from her seat and took a look at the weather outside. Things didn't look good, of course. The rain was pouring in thick sheets while the wind was blowing madly in all directions, and Zorian knew from the time loop that the storm wouldn't be ending any time soon. This was the main reason Zorian was less impatient about leaving Ree's place this time around. He couldn't just teleport to Amaya's place or create a rain shield around himself and Kiriel. No, he would have to use an umbrella like a normal person, and they would end up wet and miserable by the time they actually reached their destination. He was in no hurry to experience that. "What horrid weather," Ray said, frowning. "I think you're going to have to remain here over the night." "We can't impose on you like that," Zorian said hurriedly, shaking his head. "We'll just slowly make our way through the storm. A little rain won't kill us." "You can't be serious," Ray said, giving him an annoyed look. "I know teenage boys can be a little reckless, and I would not have said anything if it was just you being stupid, but you're taking your little sister along and you have to take this into account. Are you seriously thinking of taking her out there into that with just an umbrella?" Zorian stared at Ray for a few seconds before looking at Kiriel, who was sitting on the floor with Nachka. They were both whispering something to each other and pretending they weren't listening in on their conversation. "Kyrielle," Zorian asked her slowly. "What do you think about going?" She fumbled, rubbing her hands awkwardly. "It's raining pretty hard." Zorian sighed, taking off his glasses and massaging the bridge of his nose. After a few seconds he gave Ray an embarrassed look. He was just about to speak up, but she put a hand on his shoulder to stop him and simply nodded her head knowingly. "I'll go get some blankets," she said, before wandering off to do just that. In the corner of his eye, he could see Nachka and Kyrielle excitedly whisper to each other. They, at least, seemed pleased with this outcome. After a few seconds, Zorian clacked his tongue and decided to just roll with the situation. It was embarrassing, but there was no real harm in it. He looked through the window, silently observing the storm for a while. After a while, Ray wandered in and placed a steaming cup of tea on the windowsill beside him. Zorian gave her a curious look. "A cup of tea is necessary for proper rain watching," Ray explained to him. "Ah. Thank you," Zorian said quietly. "Sorry for the imposition. I could tell it was going to rain, but... Do I look that mean and selfish to you?" Ray asked, raising her eyebrow at him. "Hospitality had always been important to my people." "Your people?" Zorian asked her curiously, feigning ignorance. "Your acting skills are decent, but I know you saw the claws on Nachka's fingers." "You probably know what we are," Ray said, sipping slowly from her own cup of tea while standing beside him. "Yeah," Zorian admitted with a shrug. "It doesn't bother me." "Good," Ray said simply. She then dropped the subject and no longer pursued the matter. "I don't know if this is really the issue, or if there is something deeper going on, but it's pointless to get angry or frustrated at a storm. It's a force of nature, there is no fighting that. You just take shelter and wait until it ends." "Right," said Zorian quietly, taking a sip of the tea Ray had made for him. Sadly, some storms couldn't be dodged that easily. While Zorian had been escorting Kyrielle, his simulacrums had been very busy. They, along with Zack's simulacrums, constantly attacked known cult leaders and invader bases, raiding them for funds and trying to decapitate their organizations. Sadly, this hadn't been nearly as effective as they had hoped. Red Robe had clearly been very busy and most of their targets had been forewarned they were coming. Warding schemes were changed, the guards were on alert, and some people were just outright evacuated to safety. They had managed to acquire a lot of money and resources, since many of the secret caches had been protected mainly by their secrecy, and it wasn't easy to strip a base of everything that was worth money in a hurry, but Zorian doubted they had managed to deal any kind of decisive strike to their enemies. Below the city, the fighting was also intense. It was mostly the Urania fighting the cephalic rats, but Zorian's simulacrum sometimes helped the Uranian side, and since Zorian's uncontested presence would have meant a decisive victory for the Urania, Red Robe's simulacrum was always there to stop the cephalic rats from getting wiped out. Neither Zorian nor Red Robe were fighting seriously, wary of showing the enemy too much and wasting their mana reserves, but the fact Zorian's simulacrum had a much more resilient golem body meant that he was slowly getting an upper hand in these skirmishes. It remained to be seen what Red Robe would do in response to that. Zorian doubted he would let the cephalic rats just die, since they were a critical asset for the invasion forces. The simulacrums were also negotiating with various Uranian webs in the region, trying to bring in additional support for the fight. Of particular importance were the negotiations with the Silent Doorway Adepts, since they needed their help to open a connection to Koth. Zorian did not doubt for a second the negotiations were going to succeed, they had lots of things they could tempt the Silent Doorway Adepts with. The Bakura Gate addresses in particular were bound to have irresistible allure for the web. However, the issue was that these negotiations would still end up taking time, and they had to keep the web protected from enemy machinations while they were in progress. Silver Lake knew exactly how important this was to them, so an attack at the Silent Doorway Adepts was worryingly plausible. Some things were also moved forward a little. Kale and his daughter had been contacted by Zack's simulacrum disguised as a school official, who teleported them directly to Amaya's place. This was mostly because Zack and Zorian were worried that Silver Lake, whose movements were still a mystery to them, was going to target them. Kale and his daughter were too easy of a target to be left alone for long. Thankfully, Kale did not suspect a thing and even praised the Academy for their thoughtfulness. Zorian intended to evacuate Kale to Koth once he opened the gate link there, but for now he was safest at Amaya's house, since that way he would be living under the same roof as Zorian and Kiriel. Meanwhile, the simulacrum that got Zorian in the whole trouble with Kiriel got a task to get his parents away from the house as soon as possible. Thus, less than an hour after Zorian and Kiriel had boarded the train to Scioria, the simulacrum rounded up mother and father and teleported them to the port city of Luja. Their memory was modified to make them believe this was perfectly normal. It would create some discrepancies in dates, that could be a problem later. For now, though, Zorian was just glad they would soon be out in the open ocean and out of danger. He'd deal with potential consequences of his decision later. The simulacrum in his room that was focusing on stabilizing his mana reserves was also evacuated out of the house, leaving it completely empty. Even if Red Robe decided to visit the place now, the most he could do was burn it down in frustration. Which would still be devastating for mother and father, but Zorian was quite sure they wouldn't want to die to protect it. Overall, things had been going decently. There was still no sign of Silver Lake, and Red Robe was passively responding to their moves while focusing most of his energies into something they couldn't see. It made no sense to Zorian. The way he saw it, he and Zack had an absolute advantage in this conflict. Even if everything else failed, they could always inform the Eldamarian government about the invasion and it would be instant loss for Red Robe and Silver Lake. Any chance of successfully invading the city or freeing Panicseth would be gone. No matter how personally powerful they were or what clever plans they had, they could never take on the central government head-on and win. Thus, Red Robe and Silver Lake should have taken a far more aggressive stance against them by now. But there was nothing Zorian could do about that. All he and Zack could do was wait. Hopefully, by the time they recovered their full strength, they would uncover what their enemies were planning.